So we're going to go ahead and get started. Our next meeting after July will be on the 25th, so put that in your calendar. And that's going to be all about purchasing. Everything to deal with purchasing. We'll have folks here, so bring anybody that deals with purchasing and purchasing director and so on. Bring the whole staff if you want. So just please RSVP on our website. If you're not getting, for any reason, any emails from me, please let me know so I can write your name down and add you, because we've been having issues with creating a new template, and I want to make sure that I have your email. Some of you sometimes change your websites to .net, to a .org, to something else, and so the old one doesn't work, and now I need to update the new one. So, okay, so our first speaker. Oh, I need to do this. We don't have any emergencies schedule or alarm. So if you hear the alarm, the exits are on both ends, and so we would gather across the street if there's an emergency. Don't foresee one. So, but if you hear the alarm, we just need to evacuate. Our first speaker is Lena and Megan, with our attorneys from Roger Morris and Grover. And this was a request to put this presentation on. So we asked them to develop this presentation and do some research on it and bring the information to you. Just like this kind of a presentation, if you have any particular topics that you would like to hear, let me know about them, and then we'll try to get the speaker set up for you as well. So again, please help me welcome Lena and Megan.
Thank you, Jesus. Good morning. Like Jesus said, I'm Lena Engel, and this is Megan Davis, my colleague, and we are school law attorneys with Rogers, Morris & Grover. And we are very happy to speak to you today about employee cell phone use. It was an interesting topic when we started looking into it. It is all over the place. There are so many different issues that come into play regarding use of employee cell phones, because in this day and age, cell phones really are little computers. So there are all kinds of things that employees can do with employee cell phones, and a lot of different issues that arise when you're talking about district-provided devices. So we're going to talk to you about some of the highlights of those topics and give you some information about what you may be able to include in some of your policies that would help your district address some of the concerns that might arise in the legal context. So first of all, we've got an overview of what we're going to be talking to you about. So we'll discuss monitoring, we'll discuss the details of cell phone use, so specifically how employees may be using cell phones, open records issues, a couple of different variations on electronic communications, as well as federal legal standards related to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And before we get started, I wanted to find out, so how many of you have a district that provides district cell phones to employees? Okay, so we've got a few. And is anyone in a district that has a bring your own device program where employees bring their personal cell phone and they use them for district purposes? And then how about a hybrid where one party pays for the device and the other party pays for the service, or vice versa? Anybody with a hybrid system? Okay. So we've got a little bit of variation in the audience as far as how you use cell phones in your district. And so first of all, we want to talk to you a little bit about monitoring employee cell phones. And this is an interesting topic because a lot of the issues that come up, they don't necessarily hinge upon whether it is a district-provided cell phone or an employee's personal cell phone. So we're going to kind of walk you through some of that. And so from a general standpoint, employers can monitor, listen in, and record employee phone calls on employer-owned devices and phone systems. So if it's a district-provided cell phone, yes, you can monitor it. Now, for purposes of cell phone use, this includes voicemails, text messages, and voice calls. And there has been Supreme Court case law determining this. So there's legal authority that supports your ability to monitor a district-provided cell phone. Now, a couple of caveats. Generally, employers cannot monitor or obtain text from an employee's personal cell phone. So now we talk about employee personal cell phones. There is a caveat to this, however, though. If you have an employee accessing a district network from their personal device, so many districts have their own district network, you have access credentials, you go to some website where you log on and get online and do things like that. That is something where even if they're accessing from a personal cell phone, and this actually applies for any technology device, if they're logging into your district computer system, you can monitor activity on your computer system. So it doesn't matter if it's from their personal phone, their home computer, if they're logging in, for example, to a Google Apps for Education site or something to that effect, you can monitor that activity regardless of the device. And then additionally, what if the employee is on a personal device, but they're talking loudly enough that you can hear them? So they're at a district facility and they're talking on their personal device and they're saying, oh, this is a personal conversation, but they're speaking loudly and you can hear what they're saying, and they, for example, disclose FERPA information that's not an appropriate disclosure. You can actually take action even though they are on their personal cell phone and they say that it's a personal call. So there are various contexts where you can actually take some action related to employee use of their personal cell phone as well. Now, what about personal email on a district-provided cell phone? So you've got a district-provided cell phone, but they're accessing their personal email account. So it's not their district, but it's their personal. So Yahoo Mail, something like that. There are various circumstances where you may or may not be able to monitor, and there are factors that we look at to determine whether you could potentially access that information. So generally speaking, you're not really able to access that for just any purpose whatsoever. But again, it's a very fact-intensive inquiry. So if the district allows for some personal use of company devices, and we'll probably mention this a few times, but your most district CQ local policy provides for some limited personal use of district technology resources. So it's very, very likely that your district has policy allowing employees to use their district cell phone for limited personal use. The employee is using a personal account with a password, so again, Yahoo, Gmail, some personal account, and they have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So this is a very constitutional term, reasonable expectation of privacy. So if they are engaging in a personal activity through their personal email, it's not related to district business, they don't have any reason to believe that it is in any way relevant to their position with the district, then they would likely have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that information. In those cases, the district may not be allowed to read the personal email or otherwise request access to the personal email. Now, there are exceptions that may allow the district to check or access personal email. And the first one that comes to mind is public records laws. So in terms of our Texas Public Information Act, when the Attorney General looks at whether or not something constitutes public information, when you look at the type of communication that's happening on a cell phone, their focus is not on the nature of the device. So it does not depend upon whether it's a district-provided device or a personal device. What they look at is the content of the information. So if it is district-related information, then it is very likely that that information may be considered public information, even though it may be on a personal cell phone, in personal email, and something that's otherwise not linked to a district account. So let's talk about a hypothetical. So an employee, Ms. Jolie, contacts her attorney using district email on a district computer. Can she claim she has a right to privacy and the district cannot read the email? How many of you think she can claim a right to privacy? You're absolutely right. She cannot claim a right to privacy. She's using District email on a district computer, district cell phone. So again, if it's a district provided device, and then again, she's using district email, she has no expectation of privacy there. And it's very likely that your policies already state that. A lot of district acceptable use policies, and again, your CQ policy, will likely state that employees should have no expectation of privacy when using district technology resources. So she's probably already on notice of that as well. Now, one thing I want to mention actually on the hypothetical here, in terms of public records, there's a practical reality there. So when you're talking about an employee who is emailing through personal email on a personal cell phone, and they're talking about district business, it is likely that the Attorney General would consider that public information. But how do you get that? You know, you get an open records request for all communications related to X student, and you have various individuals that may be relevant to that inquiry. You send out an email saying, hey, we've gotten an open records request, they're seeking this information, please provide this to our public information officer if you have responsive information. Well, how is your employee going to know that that personal email that they sent regarding that student or regarding that district matter is potentially relevant to that open records request? That's another area where you can insert something in your policy or in your acceptable use procedures or in some communication with employees to at least put them on notice that regardless of the device they're using, the information that is transmitted through email or personal cell phone texts or something of that nature, if it is related to district business, it is very likely subject to open records laws. It would likely be public information. It's very likely subject to records retention laws. It's also, in the case of FERPA, it could potentially be an education record of a student. So if a teacher is using personal email to email about a student, which they really shouldn't be doing in the first place, but if they do, then that information is very likely an education record of a student and would be subject, similarly to the open records laws, would be subject to a request under FERPA. So if a parent requests access to student education records, that information may be subject to that request as well, even though it is on an employee's personal email or on an employee's personal device. So you want to make sure that your employees are aware of this issue and communicate that to them so that they understand that if they are going to engage in those activities, they are potentially subjecting themselves to disclosure of that information from their personal accounts or their personal devices. And probably the best practice is to not engage in those activities through personal devices or personal accounts. So if they have a district issued device, limit your district activity to your district device or district email account. Do not use personal accounts or personal devices to conduct those activities. Now let's talk about some of the ins and outs of cell phone use itself. So our phones can do a lot of things. So the first thing that comes to mind is cameras. Our phones have very sophisticated cameras these days, and they are increasingly popular, very widely used for all kinds of activities. You know, it's not just point and shoot, take a picture anymore. It's Snapchat, Instagram. You can take videos, edit them, post them to your Facebook page. There are so many different things that people can do with the camera functionality on their cell phone. And this is an area where districts actually do have some obligations to impose restrictions and monitor activity. So under the Texas Education Code section 26.009, an employee of a school district must obtain the written consent of a child's parent before the employee may, among other things, make or authorize the making of a videotape of a child or record or authorize the recording of a child's voice. So this is the general rule. Now, certain exceptions apply, and you may be aware of them. It's usually for educational or district purposes that there would be an exception to this. But unless it is a district-related activity, it's likely that parental consent would be required before a district employee could use their phone to make a recording of a student. So teachers in class, they're engaging in a really fun activity. The kids are all really excited about it. They're doing a great job. The teacher was so proud of this activity, wants to take a video of them. They may or may not be able to do that. It depends on what their intended use is. You know, if it's a district-related purpose, they may be able to take a video recording. But if it's just because the teacher wants to say, hey, let me post this to my Facebook account and show what a great teacher I am, that's very likely not permitted under this law. So you probably want to have policies in place that address that and deal with what district employees can and cannot do with some of the functionalities on their phone, like a camera, and whether they can actually take a quick snap of a kid in class or take a video recording of some district activity. You need to be careful about how employees are doing that. Now, remind staff members that if they are allowed to do that, photos and videos taken on a cell phone are still subject to the same policies as photos and videos taken with a traditional camera. So just because it's a cell phone, that does not change anything as far as what the requirements are. If they're going to post information publicly, there are FERPA concerns that come into play. So if they take a picture or video with their cell phone camera, they need to be mindful of the FERPA restrictions. Again, it may be public information under the Public Information Act because the focus is on the content and not the device. And then again, there's that records retention issue. Anytime they are engaging in an activity where they are capturing some record or documenting some information, whether it's by photograph or text or email or whatever they're doing, and it's district related, it is very likely subject to records retention requirements. So they can't just delete everything off of their cell phone. They may have to retain it just like every other paper record in the district, and just like you do with district's own computer records on district systems. Now, what about driving? So this has been an issue because states continue to pass laws to prohibit use of cell phones while driving. Individual municipalities do the same. There is a Texas statewide law that's going into effect this fall, I believe, that's related to restricting use of cell phones while driving. Now, I know there are some exceptions to that. So for example, if you're stopped at a stoplight, my understanding is as long as the vehicle is not in motion, that you could, and there are exceptions related to using mapping functionalities. But as a general rule, the government, whether it's state or local or potentially even federal, you know, I know it's something that even federal legislators have looked at, it's something that the government is restricting as far as using cell phones while driving. So in December 2001, a Florida jury awarded $21 million to a passenger in a car that was struck by a salesperson who was using a cell phone while driving. The employer was liable because he was driving for the employer. The salesperson was driving for the employer at the time of the accident. So what happens when you've got district employees who are driving and using a district cell phone while they are driving? Well, initially your reaction would be, we're immune. But wait, there is an exception to governmental immunity. So what if the driver was acting in the course and scope of his or her employment? Under the Texas Civil Practice and Remedies Code, section 101.021, governmental immunity may be waived in the event of a negligent operation of a motor vehicle by an employee of a governmental unit acting in the course and scope of their employment. So this is the one waiver of governmental immunity that's set forth in the Texas Tort Claims Act. In most cases, school districts are immune from liability, you're immune from suit. You typically would assert that immunity in tort cases and you would not have any liability for damages. When you're talking about a motor vehicle, that is the one exception to that immunity. So if you've got employees who have either district provided cell phones or they're using their employee cell phone, or their personal cell phone, if they're driving and using that phone and they are engaging in district business, so they're either on the way to a meeting for the district or they're on their phone talking about district business and they get into an accident, you very likely have a waiver of immunity and the district could potentially be held liable in that case. Yes? Not necessarily. So the main issue here is whether they're acting in the course and scope of their employment. So if they're putting on their district employee hat, whatever they're engaging in, whether they're in their personal vehicle, a district provided vehicle, whether they're using a personal cell phone, a district provided cell phone, what matters is whether or not they are driving that vehicle for the district. So they are again, driving to or from a district activity. Now, if something happens and there is a lawsuit related to this, I can guarantee you the plaintiff who's injured is going to try to come up with anything they can possibly point to say that that employee was acting in the course and scope of their employment. So if they're driving a district vehicle, that's definitely going to work against you. That's going to be something that they will point to, but that is not the determinative issue. The determinative issue is whether they are acting in the course and scope of their employment. So they could be in their personal vehicle talking on their personal cell phone, but if they're on the way to a district meeting or they're talking about district business on their cell phone and they get into an accident, it's very likely that there could be a waiver of immunity here and the district could be on the hook for liability there. Megan, you want to? Sure, absolutely.
It is very fact intensive, so if you get into obviously an accident or something happens with an employee, and you're like, well, it was work hours, uh-oh, that's the first red flag, oh, they were in the company vehicle, red flag again, definitely calling your counsel and have that analysis. Because what if the accident was at a Quickie Mart while they were picking up their lottery tickets? Okay, well now we have a little bit of a problem. Are they really on their way to the meeting, or at that point are they engaging in personal business? So you've got a little bit of, it's very fact intensive, so it's not a clean cut line. You want to consider what was the device, what was the conversation, what vehicle, what were they really doing at that time when that accident occurred? So you definitely want to call in your counselor.
Well, and in an abundance of caution, we recommend as a general rule, regardless of immunity, what is the best policy? And again, soon to be state law with certain exceptions, is just to prohibit cell phone use while operating a motor vehicle. So, you know, if the district has a policy where you have employees who are, and very likely you have numerous employees on a day-to-day basis who are operating a motor vehicle in the course and scope of their employment, whether it's a facilities supervisor who's driving to a site to assess an issue with a building, or, you know, there are various district activities where this comes into play. The best practice is probably to establish a policy that prohibits cell phone use while driving. And at the very least, if you don't want to just outright prohibit it, track the law, track the state law. Because if you are tracking the state law where there are certain exceptions, then at least you're making a reasonable attempt to limit that behavior in accordance with the law. But keep in mind that just because you're tracking the requirements of the law and you do allow exceptions while they're parked at a stop sign or something to that effect, you're still potentially going to have a waiver of immunity if they're acting in the course and scope of their employment, whether it's within the scope of what the law permits or not. So keep that in mind. It can become a very difficult issue to address. Like Megan said, it's extremely fact-intensive. Legal counsel would definitely be involved. Anybody who's been involved in a lawsuit with your district, legal counsel gets involved. We're immediately asserting governmental immunity. This is one of those situations where it would be very difficult to overcome that hurdle. So we do recommend having a policy of prohibiting use while driving a motor vehicle. Now let's talk about repair and replacement. So you're issuing cell phones to employees. The district is likely paying for that device, likely paying for that service or some combination of that. You are then making your employees stewards of that technology. What can you do as far as charging them? So you give them a brand new iPhone, they drop it, it's broken. Can you charge them for that? Can you have them bear the cost of repairing or replacing the device? So as a general rule under the Texas Education Code 31.104, generally you may not require an employee of the district who acts in good faith. Now that's a key term there, we'll talk about it in a minute. You cannot require them to pay for technological equipment that is damaged, stolen, misplaced, or not returned. And an employee may not waive this provision by contract or any other means. So not only did they put the prohibition in statute, but they actually put it in the statute that the employee cannot waive it. So you can't put something in their employment contract that has them waive this provision. If they're acting in good faith, then you probably cannot charge them for damage. Yes, Jesus. Yes. Mm-hmm. That's where you go to your good faith analysis. So what's the reasoning behind it? Why are they not turning it back in? Are they truly acting in good faith? Are they not? The thing that you can point to in terms of establishing good faith or bad faith is whether you have a policy about it. So if you have policies in place about, we're going to issue an iPad to you within 2 weeks after the end of the school year, you have to return that to our technology services department, and that's your rule, and they violate the rule unless they have some reason that it's lost or stolen or something to that effect, they're likely acting in bad faith. Now, another issue that we look at is what's called gross negligence, which is just extremely reckless behavior with complete disregard for the potential outcome. So if employees are acting with gross negligence, or you can point to some element of bad faith, you may be able to charge them. But unless you can establish that, you probably can't. And that is, unfortunately, that's one of those gray areas where to some extent you either have to take them at their word or you have to have some tangible evidence to be able to establish what they're really doing. So employee says, well, I can't return it because I can't find it. I had it in my car, I don't know what happened. And then a week later, another employer administrator sees them using it at Starbucks. You know, then you've got something that you can point to, but unfortunately, if you can't point to some evidence, it's essentially going to be your word against theirs, especially in the case of lost or stolen devices. Now, if they lost the device or it's stolen, you can have in your policy or in your any procedures that you have related to distributing those devices that if it gets lost or stolen, they have to file a police report. So you can establish some procedures for them to follow, and their failure to follow those procedures can be an indicator of bad faith. So you can't return it. You're telling me you lost it, or you're telling me it was stolen. Did you file a police report as required in our procedures that you signed off on at the beginning of the year? You know, so there are various things that you can look at, but it's a case-by-case basis. Now, the best thing you can do, actually, is the second point here. So the exception to this is a district may enter into a written agreement, so not their employment contract, we're talking about a separate written agreement with an employee whereby in consideration for the ability of the employee to use the technological equipment for personal business, the employee assumes financial responsibility for technological equipment usage off school property or outside of a school-sponsored event. So this is probably the best way that you can protect yourself because it gives you a little bit more that you can use other than this good faith exception in the first part. So if you're going to issue district technology, whether it's a cell phone, an iPad, a tablet, whatnot, what we likely would recommend that you do is enter into a written agreement with the employee where you give them, so in the law there's this concept of consideration, so it's an exchange for an exchange, there's a bargain, you're giving something, they're giving something. So you're giving them the ability to use that device for personal business in exchange for them taking on the financial responsibility for the device off school property and outside of a school-sponsored event. So you can actually enter into a written agreement or contract with them. Now there are certain requirements under the law. The written agreement has to be separate from the employment contract if they're a contract employee. And it shall clearly inform the employee of the amount of the financial responsibility. So you have to set forth the value of the device, the cost of certain types of repairs, if it's a device that's prone to have certain repairs required like screen replacements. And then you have to advise the employee to consider obtaining appropriate insurance. This is one of those situations where you say, hey, we recommend you go get AppleCare for your phone. It costs $50. This will repair it without great expense to you if you damage it or lose it outside of school. So, you know, there are various options that you can offer to them. Now, what a lot of my clients do is in addition to policies such as CQ Local. So CQ Local, again, typically says district technology may be used for limited personal use. So the policy already gives you the ability to permit limited personal use of the device. Many districts have device handbooks or other policies or other types of documents regarding specifically the use of the device and device upgrades, repairs, and replacements. And they require written acknowledgement. So a lot of districts have, for example, a tablet PC handbook where when a district employee is issued a tablet PC, they have to read through this handbook, and the district signs and they sign, and they actually sign an acknowledgement form that says, in consideration for my ability to use this for personal business, I am assuming financial responsibility off school property or outside of school sponsored events. Yes? Well, of course. I mean, it's always going to be subject to your acceptable use policies. So anytime they're using a district provided device, even if they're sitting at home surfing the web at 10 o'clock at night on their cell phone, it still has to be lawful and legal activity. And that would be governed by your acceptable use policy, of course. But this way you can establish some type of written agreement where they're understanding that they are taking on financial responsibility, at least to the extent that they're using that device off school property or outside of a school sponsored event. So unless they're locking that cell phone in their desk drawer when they leave the office, once they leave the office, if they lose it, they are then on the hook for the cost of that device. So there are some exceptions. We recommend that you work with your legal counsel to figure out how to work that into your policy. But depending on how you're issuing the devices and what types of written agreements you have in place, you may or may not be able to charge them for damage to those devices. And I know that that can get very expensive, especially when you're talking about things like iPads and tablets. Now let's quickly revisit the hypothetical. So Miss Jolie from earlier, what if she was emailing her attorney about an incident with a student, Brad Pitt? What if she was emailing her attorney about an incident with a student, Mr. Brad Pitt, but it was on her personal account on a personal device? So based on what we've talked about, if she's on a personal account and a personal device and she's emailing her attorney about an incident with a student, do you think that that is something that's considered private? Is that district activity? Is that personal activity? Private. You think it's private? Her attorney. She is emailing her attorney. But she's emailing about a student.
But it's about her interaction with that student, and it's her attorney, so she can't take the right away from her to converse with her attorney about school issues.
Well, and this is one where the whole point of the hypothetical is that it is a really fact-intensive gray area. It's really hard to tell in this case, because initially you would look at it and say, okay, she's on a personal account on a personal device, that's personal. And then again, you bring up the point of attorney-client privilege. Not only is she emailing with somebody, she's emailing with her attorney about something that happened with a student. There's an attorney-client privilege issue there. But then she's also emailing details about a student that could potentially be considered an education record of the student, because it's specific information about an interaction with a student or a student's abilities or something that happened with the student. She is also emailing about district business. So is it potentially a public information? Is it potentially an open record? So this is one of those scenarios where it is very, very fact intensive. So it's not cut and dry. We recommend that you involve legal counsel, because you have to climb a lot of these hurdles to try to figure out whether you can even disclose that information.
And courts have found that your attorney-client privilege is not absolute. So just assuming that your employee has emailed an attorney doesn't mean you won't necessarily have a right through some other loophole to access that information depending on the circumstances. But you also have to consider, let's be honest, if you've got a situation where you're trying to crack into an employee's private email because you think something's going on with a student, there's probably other authorities involved, and you're not the highest one on the totem pole. So there's probably the police involved, there may be in that larger investigation. So if you're at that point, trust me, you'll be talking to an attorney anyway, so you don't have to make that analysis by yourself.
Right, and there are various other ways to get the information, whether it's through subpoena, really depends on the legal proceeding that you're involved in. But these issues can get very, very complicated when you start talking about district business on personal email or personal devices, and it is very fact intensive. So we talked a lot about open records so far, so let's just go over open records information a little bit more. So is information on cell phones subject to open records requests? Very potentially, yes. The Texas Public Information Act is still a concern. If it's district-related emails, text, apps, etc., it is very likely going to be public information, barring some exception, like you mentioned with the attorney-client privilege. Personal emails may be subject to open records request if the nature of the email is in connection with the transaction of conducting business, regardless of if it came from an employee or employer-owned device. So there are still instances where the district may request access to personal email. Ms. Jolie from our hypothetical may have her personal emails from her personal account reviewed. Now, a couple of other interesting technicalities about employee cell phone numbers and open records issues. So the Attorney General's open records letters, there's a couple of letters referenced there, have held that Section 552.117 of the Texas Public Information Act, which concerns the confidentiality of certain information of public officials and employees. So this is that kind of catch-all list of employee personal information, address, information that would describe their relatives or indicate that they have certain family members. All of that is typically confidential, so districts can withhold that in response to an open records request. The Attorney General has specifically held that that applies to employees' personal cellular telephone numbers. So if they have a personal cell phone number, that is typically personal information of that employee that can be withheld from an open records response. Now, an exception to that is Open Records Decision number 506, which says that cellular telephone numbers of county officials, so this would apply to school districts as well, may not be withheld where the county paid for the initiation of service and for telephone bills, and which service was intended to be used by officials in conducting official public business, because the public has a legitimate interest in the performance of official public duties. So now you're talking about a district-provided device potentially, or even just district-provided service that's paid for by the district. That cellular telephone number would likely be public information. And then there's Open Records Decision number 670. A governmental body may withhold the personal cellular telephone number of any individual who meets the definition of peace officer without requesting a decision from the Attorney General. So this is the general exception that you can withhold peace officers' personal information. There is not any Attorney General decision explaining whether or not this exception here would apply to the peace officer. I would argue that it probably doesn't, because there's a different interest in withholding peace officers' information, but that's probably something you would have to seek an Attorney General decision on if that instance ever came up. Yes?
Go back to the previous slide, another question about private email about public purpose. Somebody comes in with a public information request and says, I want anything to do with Joe Blow, student, in the governmental record. If pursuing that request, the entity does not ask every single adult who's ever had contact with that person if they have something on a private email account, they're to fork it over. What is the onus for the entity to search for those records beyond the scope of their system?
Well, so that's a great question, and there are a lot of different issues that come up in that scenario. So typically what the courts are going to look at, or what the Attorney General is going to look at, is whether you made a reasonable effort. So if you have, and with a student it's kind of a touchy situation, because we're likely, as a district attorney, as the attorney for the district, we're likely going to say that none of that is subject to disclosure under the TPIA because it's confidential by other law, which is FERPA. So we're typically going to argue, no, none of this is getting disclosed. We don't have anything that's public information that's responsive because it's made confidential by other law. But if it's a case, say for example, you have a purchasing director and they've been engaged in activities with a particular vendor over a certain contract, and somebody submits an open records request about, we'd like all communications regarding X contract. And you don't know who they may have been communicating with. I mean, we've got vendors and salespeople who may be reaching out to various district individuals, trying to take them to lunch or trying to do different things to try to get in with the district. And so if you make a reasonable attempt, you know who is likely to have had communications regarding that particular issue, then you would want to reach out to those individuals. So to our best knowledge, these are the individuals who would likely have this information. As long as you're not intentionally leaving someone out who you would suspect probably does, you're probably fine, because you're making a reasonable effort to capture as much of that information as possible. And then if you have something in your policy that makes it clear to employees that if you're transacting district business on personal email, that may be subject to open records request, that helps you as well because you've put them on notice. So when you send that email out to your entire purchasing department and say, we need all of you to check your district email and your personal email or any other personal devices or texts or whatnot related to this particular contract and provide all responsive information, they've been put on notice of that and they understand that they have an obligation and you have made your best effort to capture. If there's somebody that gets left out because you had no reason to believe that that person would have been communicating and it was on personal email that you don't have access to, there's nothing you can do about that. I would argue that that information is not in the custody, control, or possession of your district. You don't have any control over that. So I think you're probably fine in those circumstances, but you do need to make a reasonable effort to capture that information. And then I want to be mindful of the time. I'm going to turn it over to Megan, and she's going to talk to you about electronic communications.
I think this is where I say, bless your heart, you're stuck with me. And I am not as dynamic a speaker as Lena, so I'm so sorry. I'll just say that in advance. If you want to get coffee, I'm not offended. So generally, when you're looking at electronic communication, we're talking about everything now. Let's just take a step back from the cell phone. We're going into computer use. We're going into social media. You've already got a lot of these policies in place. Whether you realize it or not, a lot of your board policy already speaks to these issues. So you're talking about the confidentiality of student records, health and personnel information, district records. That's already covered under policies FL, DH, and GBA. Your copyright law, and that you don't want your employees to infringe upon that. It's already spoken to in policy CY. You have a prohibition against harming others by knowingly making false statements about a colleague or the school system. That's already in there under policy DH. You have a prohibition against inappropriate electronic communication with a student or minor, including but not limited to cell phone, text messaging, email, instant messaging, blogging, social networks. That should be in your DH as well. Your FERPA, including retention, confidentiality of student records, that's in CPC and FL. You should have a prohibition against soliciting or engaging in sexual conduct or romantic relationships with a student. That should be in your DHB. You wish they knew that before they ended up on the Channel 11 News. And of course you have CIPA, which is the Children's Internet Protection Act, and their online behavior should be in your CQ and your other internet safety policy, which is required under CIPA. If you don't have one of those yet, you should. A lot of people are signing off on their CIPA without realizing they need an actual policy. Go ahead and check on that, by the way, just a little heads up. A lot of these things are already spoken to in your policies, or they should be at least, especially if you're following TASB. So let's get into the meat and where all the dirt and the news and the 6 o'clock disaster shows up, and that's on social media. We have a variety of sources. There's Facebook, there's Twitter, there's Snapchat, there's Instagram. There's ones I've never even heard of, and I think my 6-year-old knows how to use them. You are allowed to impose limitations on posting from an employer-owned device. So for example, you can have a limitation that says an employee cannot post on their personal web pages from a district device. That's perfectly acceptable. Just make sure it's known up front. You cannot ask for passwords to a social media site for a personal page. That could be a violation of law. Just because of being mindful of time, I'll say this quickly. There are a lot of states now that are starting to write that into their law and have address specifically your ability to access personal web passwords or not. Texas hasn't done it yet, but I'm sure it's coming down the pike. You can, though, constitutionally respond to an employee's social media post on their personal page, and we'll get into that in just a moment. So you want to think, again, these forums are still subject to public information requests, depending on the nature of the post. So you want to also consider, are you going to allow your employees to use district logos on websites? What if they're on their page, you can allow them to say that they're a district employee and use your logo? What if they end up posting something that, while it's personal, you don't as a district want to necessarily look as though you're endorsing? You want to really consider those factors. So what about use in the classroom? It is a new and popular thing. My 6-year-old got to use a Google Chrome and an iPad every day in her kindergarten class this last year. It was an awesome experience for her. Is that allowed? Absolutely. We expect that these days. Most schools are moving to a one-on-one program. So you want to think about, do you need to ask on the front end for parent permission, or do you want to have the ability for parents to opt out of use? Usually it's easier to have them opt out, because if you say on the front end, oh, choose to enroll, what happens when the parent says, oh, we don't want them to use it? Now what's your teacher doing? So you want to consider use and be reasonable. What's the effect in practical terms as much as in legal terms? Think about it before someone posts something. Do you want to have a supervisor have to approve it before it can go on a public site? You want to consider, do you only want to allow closed forums where the parents have to enroll in order to see something, or do you want to have their particular website be public for everyone? So, Catherine, a district employee, has posted a homophobic rant on her personal Facebook page. She never mentions the district, but she does use profane language. While she's not Facebook friends with any of her students, several still see her post as it was posted under a public privacy setting. Can the district still discipline her? What do y'all think? Most likely, yes. I saw a lot of the heads bobbing, yes.
Dealt with this issue before.
Districts can discipline employees for posts on on personal social media accounts in certain instances. You want to consider what's called the Pickering balancing test. Are they speaking pursuant to official duties? So is this your school board president hops on to their school board webpage and goes off on a rant about how they do not appreciate how the superintendent is acting right now? Can you punish them? Yes, they are in that point acting as the school board official. If they're not acting in their public capacity, official duties, then there's maybe no protection. So let's move on to, is it a matter of public concern? If not, they may not have protection. It's a personal beef. That's not something you're going to be protected for. So you need to go down then and balance their interest with the district as an employer versus the employee as a citizen. You're getting into their constitutional rights. So the first analysis, usually, are they speaking in their public capacity? Did your superintendent stand up at a board meeting and say something that was completely off the wall and inappropriate? Can you discipline them? Absolutely. Did they go stand on their front porch as John Doe citizen and start ranting? Can you get in their way? You need to start balancing there and really consider what was it they were speaking about? In what capacity was he speaking? And really balance, do you as the district have, what are your rights, what are your concerns versus what were his concerns as a private citizen in that moment? And that's a very fact-intensive inquiry going into what was the topic, the nature, the forum. One way you can kind of curb some of that behavior is, of course, lay it out in your employee handbook. Okay, have a discussion about what is appropriate, especially as to social media.
Well, one comment on that is that this filters all the way down. So there are actually cases on boards censuring a board member because of their activity. There are cases on boards disciplining superintendents. There are in cases on even the lowest level employees, their supervisors disciplining them. Usually it's something where HR gets involved and you're involving some kind of legal counsel, whether it's general counsel or outside counsel, but usually you do have a constitutional ability to discipline any level of district employee. And if it doesn't really matter if they're using a district cell phone or their personal cell phone. What really matters there is their capacity as a district employee or a representative or official of the district. So they're not necessarily safe just because they're using a personal cell phone and their personal Facebook account.
So here's where it gets controversial. Electronic communication with students. You have a lot of considerations that you probably want to think about as you're laying out your policy, your internet safety policies especially. Think about the scope of communication. Are you going to restrict it so that teachers can talk to their students about anything, or only within the scope of work? Do you want to allow them to check in only, on the weekends? Do you want to restrict the hours? Do you want to have exceptions where you cannot text students at all unless maybe you're engaged in after-school activities? If you're in an extracurricular, maybe texting and the urgency of that instant response is more important. Do you want to allow social media posting at all between an employee and a student? Maybe it's only on professional web pages. They have their school Facebook page, their class Facebook page, but maybe they're not allowed to engage with students on their personal Facebook page. You want to think about informing your employees that the district can request phone numbers, websites, their information to know how they're communicating with their students. You're going to want to have some oversight and the ability to warn them, hey, we can come look over your shoulder and make sure what you're doing is appropriate.
And I want to note there, I've actually dealt with this, there are now apps for that. So there are specifically vendors that offer apps related to teacher-student communications, and they have various abilities. So if districts purchase the app and distribute it through their district network, and teachers have the app on their cell phone and kids have the app on their cell phone. You have different settings where district administrators can at any time go in and monitor those communications. You can request downloads and copies of those communications. And so that may be a safe way for districts, and I don't want to endorse any particular vendor. I know there's a number that do it. But that is something that districts are looking at as a safe way for districts to allow these types of communications while still maintaining that oversight, is actually through the app itself, as opposed to trying to monitor the device.
So I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to go pretty quickly here. You do need to make a determination of what is appropriate communication, what is inappropriate communication, and remember that all of those communications are again subject to public information and records retention requirements. Most districts, the best practice is to say we do not allow texting with students. Again, you might allow certain exceptions. Maybe your coaches are allowed to because they need to know where's the student, they're not on the bus. Those things are fine. And in your policy, clearly define what is communication, what is electronic media, how do your teachers need to be using it. So Mrs. Dave is outraged and concerned that her daughter has been emailing her history teacher, Mr. Buster, at all hours of the night. She points to emails from Mr. Buster to her daughter at 1 a.m., 2:15 a.m., and 2:46 a.m. The nature of the emails is completely professional, and there's no inappropriate material. However, there's been some raised eyebrows and innuendo. Is there something the district could have done to prevent this? Anybody have any ideas? What about restricting the hours of communication? You can restrict them and say, employees, yes, you can communicate with those students, but don't do it between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. There goes the way the idea that the teacher's got some nefarious activity with a student in the middle of the night. So here's complete separation. We're going to take a quick switch to the Fair Labor Standards Act. When you have an employee use of cell phones or devices and they are not exempt, so we're talking about your hourly workers, you do need to consider their use off-site. Okay, be aware that they may be subject to overtime pay for as little use that Labor Department has determined as little as 10 minutes a day is something you might need to be paying them for. Because think about it, 10 minutes a day at the end of the week, you've almost worked an extra hour. So at that point, you need to be paying them. So we know the number is a little lower than that. What they've said is it's de minimis or insubstantial is when you can say, oh, don't worry about it. So by that, employee picks up the phone at 6 a.m. and goes, oh my gosh, I've had 6 emails since last night. Wonk. You can probably write that off. Employee wakes up at 6 a.m. and starts responding to emails, they're on the clock. So you really want to consider at which point are we going away from a de minimis use of cell phones by an hourly worker and moving into a more substantial use. And you've got to remember, substantial doesn't mean I sat down for one long hour block at a time. It can be little increments that add up over time. You can address this, though, in your policy. You have options of laying out, we don't expect you to use your phone after hours. We don't want you answering emails unless you're on call. You can say that clearly so the employee can't come to you at the end of the week and go, oh, I worked 17 hours from home. Overtime. You can say, that's lovely, but our policy says you shouldn't have been doing that anyway. Did you have a direct communication from a supervisor saying we expected that of you because of an emergency? So keep in mind, if you warn them up front, it's clear in your handbook, there shouldn't be a problem. So real quickly, Bob, a non-exempt technology department employee, so he's hourly, is on call this weekend. He has to carry a cell phone and be within 45 minutes of campus. He's not paid for all the time spent carrying a cell phone, but he is paid for the time spent responding to calls and when he returned to campus to reboot the server. Does that comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act? Yes. You're thinking about restrictions on his freedom. At that point, being 45 minutes from campus, that's most of Houston he can go and visit. You're not asking him to check his phone every 5 seconds. He's really got most of his freedom in that moment. Where you have a problem is when he picked up his phone, and at that point, he's on company business. Now, this is very different than Hurricane Ike's coming in, and you told that hourly worker to go stand next to the server and watch it and make sure it doesn't blow and make sure it doesn't flood and make sure it's working for the next 48 hours. At that point, you've restricted his freedoms. You've told him where he's going to be. He can't go off and run a grocery errand. He can't go see his friends. He can't go to a movie. His poor wife is going to be at home alone, fending for the house by herself. You've changed the whole scenario. So you really want to think about their freedoms, their liberties, and what point they go on the clock. We didn't speak to it here, but another consideration is at what point do you start paying for their commute time to go back in to reboot that server? So real quickly, because I know we're out of time, just some quick takeaways. Highlight these issues in your policy up front. Think about it in your employee handbook. Address cell phone use while driving. Be reasonable. They're probably going to use it for personal use. What are your restrictions on that? Warn them you're going to be able to look at that if they're using the district server or a district device. Talk about their expectation of privacy. Cover the repairs, the replacements, the upgrades. Remind employees that they still should be applying these rules about FERPA to cameras and pictures and how they're posting it. And then, of course, we recommend that you have them sign off that they have received and understand and will comply with those employee handbooks. Thanks for y'all's attention and time. Everybody's still awake, so I feel like I did a good job. But thank y'all.
Before I get started, as always, I had to go through a little bit of the housekeeping rules for me. Number one, while there will be time for question and answers at the end, if at some point you want to interrupt me and you have a question, you want me to run off on a tangent or want me to go into more detail or clarify something because I went too fast, please feel free to interrupt me. As an economist and someone who's been married for 11 years, I'm used to being told I'm wrong about something right up front. So please feel free to interrupt me. I'm used to it. Also, of course, working for the Fed, I do have to give you a bit of a disclaimer in that my opinions are mine and mine alone and not necessarily representative of the views of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, bank presidents, officers, or anyone else associated with the Federal Reserve Bank in any way, shape, or form. And so that's pretty much covers me. So what I'm going to talk about today here, I'm going to talk about the overall Houston economy. I'm going to start relatively high altitude. All right, and I'm going to slowly zero down into some of the major trends that are affecting the regional economy, and we can talk more in depth about each of these slides as we go. And again, I encourage you to interrupt me, and if you have a question or want me to talk about something a little bit more, please do so. It's more fun for me, and it's more engaging for y'all if we do that. So first off. So I decided to open up with this one. You know, it's been 6 months, and I feel like I need to remind people that the Houston economy is a very different place than it used to be. All of the attention and much of my attention today is going to be focused on, or has been focused on, what's happening in the oil markets, and that's still, you know, the thing that governs Houston's volatility. The thing that governs the state of Texas's volatility is still oil, but it still represents a much smaller portion of the overall economy than it used to. And this is a particular measure for Houston's overall industry mix, and it's measuring how different is Houston's industry mix from the rest of the country. How different are we really? And as if you look at it, numbers that are low means that Houston's industry mix is very different from the rest of the country, and numbers that are high in this measure means that the Houston's industry mix is very similar to the rest of the country. So one being perfectly exactly identical. And what you look at, and you look at this chart, you see 1975 all the way through the mid-80s, we were a very different place from the rest of the country. And then the mid-80s hit. We had the major oil bust, the largest oil bust that we have good data for employment, up until just a few years ago was the largest oil bust. And then you see from 1984 on, you really see this number rising as we lose a lot of jobs. We lose 1 in 7 jobs actually in the late 80s in Houston area region. We saw a drop in population. We had a huge oversupply in commercial real estate as a result of some rules that had incentivized excessive in real estate investment that ultimately wound up going away. And so we just had a very different economy at that point, and we started, and then the early 90s came around. Oil was getting better, you know, it wasn't doing anything extravagant, and you see Houston then participates in the boom of the 90s and the growth of professional and business services. Houston participates in that boom. Professional and business services employment, everything from accounting to engineering services, we participate in that. And you see our industry mix slowly and surely become more and more like the rest of the country. Now, up until about 2004, 2005, then you see it dip down. And then the Great Recession hits, you see it rise up a bit. And that little bit right there is important later when we think about real estate, because what happened in 2005, caused our industry mix to look different from the rest of the country was construction jobs. And that's going to become a very important factor when understanding what's happening to real estate markets in Houston now later on in the presentation. So that first dip right here in 2008, all right, that was construction jobs. And then we had the growth in oil and gas and manufacturing related jobs as a result of the shale boom, and that tipped us back up again. And then of course the shale boom ended, and we saw our industry, now our industry mix is rising to look more and more like the rest of the country over the last 3 years, okay? So this is the story of the evolutions of Houston's economy. We're a lot more like the country. Now, you've already gotten like the rest of the country than we used to be. You've already gotten that from what I've said. What does that mean? What it means is, when I go through the analysis, and I've done this a dozen different ways with a dozen different types of quantitative analyses, and what I found is that while today I can say with some certainty that Houston is less sensitive to shocks in oil and gas sector than we used to be. Not much. I can spin, depending on what specific date ranges I choose and what specific data I choose, I can spin it to say that Houston is as sensitive to oil and gas today as we were in the 70s and 80s. I can make it say that we are less sensitive to oil and gas. I think it's more likely that we're less sensitive to oil and gas than we used to be. But one other thing is different. That is really, really important, and it's written in this graph, is that back in the 70s and 80s, independent of the oil price, Houston didn't care what was happening in the rest of the country. It's like, all right, what's the oil price today? It's about $70 in real dollar, in current dollars, about $70 in current dollar terms. Okay, well, we're happy with that. What's happening in the rest of the country? They're in recession. Well, we don't really care. As long as we've got good oil prices, we're good. The rest of the country doesn't really matter so much. Independent of oil prices today, whatever the country is doing, if there's a shock to the country, whether we have a recession or you're seeing economic growth, that can have as big an impact on the city as oil and gas. And to the point where even 2% growth, 2% GDP growth at the national level over the course of a year has the capacity to offset a 30% drop in the energy industry. Not entirely, but that is a buffer against the volatility of oil and gas that the region simply did not have before. We did not have that in the 70s and 80s, and we've got it now. So we are a more diverse region. And this is important because it's very easy in this town. You're looking at the headlines, you're seeing what's happened, the volatility and layoffs and hirings and everything that's happening in the oil and gas industry, and can lose sight of the fact that this is not a one-horse town anymore. But that's not to say that we are immune. This graph right here, what you're looking at is the change in something called the Business Cycle Index. The Business Cycle Index for Houston. It is a coincident index of economic indicators. We produce this for Houston. We produce it for all the major metros in Texas, and many of the other Federal Reserve banks produce it for other cities around the country. So whatever you are, there's probably something like this not too far from you that's measuring economic activity. And at the local level, this is one of the most timely measures of overall economic activity, and it's probably more reliable than say, Metro GDP. All right, it's more reliable than Metro GDP. Something good worth looking at, these business cycle indexes. Well, you can see our average growth rate in our business cycle index is about 3.2%, going all the way back to 1978. All right, about average 3.2%. Now, at the end of 2014, oil prices collapsed. We'd gone through a big boom in the oil sector with the shale revolution, and you see the growth rate really start dropping really in February, but it's the second quarter of 2015 when it really took hold. That was when the first big round of layoffs hit. All right, and so you see economic activity begin to contract at negative 0.8%, so just a little bit less than 1% contraction, relatively mild. All right, as far as recessions go, and then by 2016, really kind of hopes that this was going to be over quick, really went away. And in January, February of 20, of course, we hit $26 in mid-February for oil prices. And in 2016, companies that had been holding out decided we can't make it another year. A lot of the lagged effects, a lot of the impact from people losing their jobs the year before, a lot of the impact from lost wages the year before began to hit in 2016, and so overall economic activity slowed further in 2016. And so far, for the data that we have this year, it looks like Houston has exited a very mild recession at the end of 2016. Now, I will caution that the data so far this year is going to be subject to several revisions. And I think my analysis suggests, and you'll see some of this, we might be able to get to some of it later. My analysis suggests that some of this data, some of this growth this year will probably be revised away, be revised down, but I think the timing is still going to be about right, that we've exited and that we're back on our growth path, if a tepid one. We're going to be back on our growth path. So here we are. The data so far this year says we're growing at about 3.3%, about our trend rate. Houston, just to give you a little bit of historical perspective, 3.2%. You look at our employment growth rate, you look at our GDP growth rate, we're a relatively volatile place, but on average we always outpace the rest of the nation in terms of growth because we're just a relatively dynamic economy, and we've got oil and gas, of course, has really helped with that. Without oil and gas really doing much, say, if you look at our growth rates versus the rest of the country, our growth rates when oil and gas is really, really good, we're smoking it, we're killing it. When it's in a recession, when oil and gas prices have tanked, we slow down a lot, maybe even enter recession. And when oil and gas really isn't doing much, we still tend to grow faster than the rest of the country. All right? So this is what's happened the last 2 years. You see the oil bust, and you look at job growth. Houston, using revised data, this is going to look different from a lot of data that you might have seen from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They don't have their data is not as up to date as this. Using up-to-date data, no job growth for 2 years in Houston. 2015, 2016, flat as a pancake. But we've got some growth this year. All right? Without Houston growth, without energy, what did the rest of Texas do? Texas, red, basically grew at about the same pace as the rest of the nation without energy. The I-35 corridor kept going. And their industry mix, particularly Dallas, looks a lot like the rest of the country. And so whatever the rest of the country is doing, the rest of Texas kind of participates in that. And so they grew the same rate as the rest of the country. And the green line is, of course, the rest of the country, employment growth. Now, unemployment rate is a little different. You've got there's a lot of stuff on this graph. The PDF will be available and shared, so y'all can peruse it at your leisure later. But the red line is the unemployment rate. The blue line is a smoothed, moving average 6-month growth rate. All right. The labor force and unemployment data at the local levels have very small sample sizes. And we are an inherently volatile city relative to many other places. And so the data is really noisy. So anytime you're looking at something below the state level, doesn't matter what town you're in, you're looking at an unemployment rate, you got to ask yourself, what's the trend doing right now? Because the most recent number is going to be really volatile, and you're going to have to interpret it with a lot of salt. Take it with a grain of salt. You can clearly see the recessions when the unemployment rates shot up. And here you see the unemployment rate coming up in the wake of the oil bust. And that unemployment rate has recently ticked down. And the reason why it's ticked down is this blue line. See, first off, for a while there during the oil bust, the labor force in Houston, total number of people who have a job or say they want a job, this is the famous U3 unemployment rate labor force statistic, that labor force calculation, we stopped growing. We had people leaving the labor force. There were some people still moving into the area, but on net, our labor force was not growing during that time period. Now you fast forward to 2016, 2017, labor force growth picks up. And typically, as the labor force grows, it pushes up on the unemployment rate. And as it contracts, typically it pulls down on the unemployment rate. And what's happening right here is part of what happened in 2016 is the labor force started growing again, started pushing up on unemployment because people rejoined the labor force thinking, all right, well, I've been out of work for a while, my benefits have run out, or I've just moved to the town because migration still is going on, and people said, all right, I better come get a job. I'm going to be in the labor market. Other things, of course, have happened, of course, with the energy starting to come back, and you're seeing the unemployment rate now tick down, both because we are adding jobs and because people but also remember, people are joining the labor force. The labor force is growing. So that downtick in the most recent data on unemployment is actually pretty significant, and it's another good sign that we really have turned a corner. Because because labor force is growing, that should be pushing up on unemployment. but we're adding enough jobs that it offsets that, and you see the unemployment rate drop. So things looking better. Things are looking better. We've now got a couple different data points that say, yeah, all right, this is looking better. This outlook is improving. Always look for several data points. Now this is a much less heartening data point, but it's something that we got to pay attention to, particularly in the local area. This is wages. This is the total wages and salaries. Wages and salaries, not total income, wages and salaries paid to employees, not individuals, to employees in the greater Houston area, in the metropolitan area, all right? That's the red line. The blue line is seasonally adjusted real retail sales, all right? And the red line is seasonally adjusted as well, but the blue line is retail sales. Couple things here. Number one, they tend to move together. Makes sense, right? Income or wages should be positively associated with what's happening to retail sales. If people have more disposable income, more money, they should be spending more of it, right? In terms of total dollar value. And so you see red line here after the Great Recession, rising, rising, rising. We hit the first and second quarter of 2015, and that number starts dropping. And you see it bouncing around, but it drops all the way through the end of 2016, and the fourth quarter of 2016 is the most recent data we have on wages. We've got some early estimates for real retail sales, but we tend to leave those out and wait for them to get more complete data. Wages are falling. Now, why are wages falling? We've lost a lot of jobs, but we've also added a lot of jobs. Remember, total job growth is flat. Total job growth was flat over the last 2 years. But the jobs we lost were relatively high wage. And the jobs we added were relatively lower wage. All right? So the jobs we lost in oil and gas sectors have an average weekly wage of anywhere from $2,600 to $2,800 a week as the average. Whereas, say, leisure and hospitality, which was a major source of total jobs growth over the last 2 years, leisure and hospitality average weekly wage at the beginning of 2015 was about $450, $480 a week. It's a big change in the wage profile and the earnings of the people who have jobs. All right? And that's pulling down our total available disposable income, and of course that's pulling down real retail sales. Now, oil prices have been a little bit healthier, and Houston does respond to oil prices, sometimes in dramatic fashion. This shaded area here is the Great Recession. All right, that's the Great Recession. Real retail sales surged. Anyone remember why? Anyone remember why? Why would retail sales surge in the middle of the Great Recession in Houston? Bueller? Anyone? All right, well, what happened in 2008 was, one of the things that happened in 2008 was the global commodity price boom, global commodity price bubble. That was the year in mid-2008 when oil prices shot up to $140 at one point. $140. Gold was through the roof, industrial metals were through the roof, and by the end of the year we realized that's a bubble, that's not going to stick around, and the prices collapsed. Houston never saw a barrel of $140 oil that didn't make us immediately run out and all buy brand new F-150s. So that's what happened. We ran out and we spent a bunch of money because that oil prices were high. That went away, and of course that was when Houston actually did join the rest of the country in recession. We were last in and one of the first areas out of the Great Recession because of the higher commodity prices at the front end of that recession. And so now here we find ourselves at the end of exiting another local recession. This trend in wages is probably going to extend into 2017. I doubt we'll see much strengthening. Well, we might see it pause. We might see it bottom out and plateau. Or I guess maybe not plateau is the right word. Maybe it's bottom out. I don't know how long we'll have to wait before we see it grow again. But wages and retail sales tend to lag what's happening in the economy. And we've just turned the corner, which means that I think we're going to see another quarter of weak retail sales and weak wage growth in the first quarter of this year. Second quarter might be a different story. Yes, ma'am? Yes.
Does that include, I guess I'm not sure what retail sales is, does that include internet purchases?
Yes and no. So the real retail sales is a calculation that comes from the data the comptroller provides. And so depending on where you are in the series, I don't know how they phased it in, but I know that they've started counting some internet sales as they are getting some retail dollars for that in Texas. So if the warehouse that the online purchase was distributed to, if the warehouse that an online purchase was made from is in Texas, you pay sales tax. If it's from out of state, we don't see that. And so that is one problem in looking at these real retail sales numbers. We got to think about, especially, this is especially important when you're thinking about seasonally adjusted real retail sales, because so much of our retail sales is tied to the end of the year. And so many online purchases are happening at the end of the year that maybe our seasonal adjustments are wrong now because we've got this change in the way people are purchasing. So that is a very good point. I don't know how significant it is relative to the total retail sales, but it is something that we're going to have to keep an eye on because it's a growing trend, and it's one of the things that we're hearing cited as for weakness in a lot of brick and mortar stores. I'm sorry? Well, no, the malls, I think they just opened the last mall, I think it was in Florida, the last mall that is currently under construction. Like there are no malls under construction. But retail construction has actually been very strong. It has been a bright spot. Particularly grocery-anchored retail strip centers in the area. And that's tied to, a lot of that, of course, is, you can heat map it. It's around the Grand Parkway, where they're building new development and they're putting in new houses, and where the population growth is. You're still seeing a lot of that. And so they seem to be doing okay. But again, they've got this challenge from online retailers. Now we've got, Whole Foods just got bought by Amazon. What's that going to do? I'm one of the guilty parties. My age group. I expect at least 3 or 4 deliveries from Amazon a week for various household products. So including everything from air filters, whatever. So yeah, it's a trend that we've got to keep an eye on. I don't know to what extent we have the tools for this particular data set to parse that. Hopefully we'll have something in the next year or two that we can say, here's what happened to that total retail sales adjusted for this rise of the internet. So employment by industry. Now this you're looking at a more recent data. I'm zeroing in on more recent data here, and you're looking at 2 things. The 3-month % change, annualized, and the year-over-year change. And the reason why I do 3-month %, why I didn't tell you what happened last month, is because, again, data volatility. All right, you got to kind of smooth it out a little bit, look at what happened over the last couple of months, not just what's happened in the last data point. And when you look at this data, there should be something that is nice to notice. Number one, most everything is on the right-hand side of this graph. Most everything is growing in terms of industry as categories. There's a couple that aren't. And the year-over-year, so May 2016 to May 2017, look at this red bar right here. Mining is still down. Over the last 3 months, they're growing again. If you look at construction jobs, year-over-year down 4%, and still contracting in the most recent data. Okay? Construction is a whole other story, and I'm going to get onto that in a little while. But for most of the Great Reset, for most of Houston's 2014, 2015, 2016 oil bust, services sectors were growing and goods producing sectors were contracting. Now we've started to see professional and business services, including employment services, staffing firms, temporary placements. This is typically a leading indicator of employment growth because the first thing you do is you bring in the temps, you call up the staffing agencies before you start growing again. And so that looks pretty good. You're looking at government, and that's pretty much all teachers, as where the government, local teachers, has been growing. Education and health services, that's pretty much all health. Private educational services is a relatively small percentage of that total. That's pretty much all health growth, and I'll be a little bit more on that later. That was also a big grower over the course of the last couple of years, was education and health services. The health sector was really a source of strength over the last couple of years. And then, of course, leisure and hospitality as still growing strong, but it's growing much more slowly than it was. Now, before I start diving into what I think are the main factors driving the direction of the regional economy, I want to make sure that we don't have any other questions that y'all want to go down or address to the best of my ability.
Can you back up on the last screen?
Yes, ma'am.
I guess I wasn't listening. The 12.4% increase of manufacturing.
Yes, that is an annualized growth rate.
What's up with that one?
All right, well, you'll see in a couple of slides. Ah, no worries, no. No, that's excellent. No, what are we making? Most of that growth, a big chunk of that growth is coming from a sector called fabricated metals manufacturing, and a big chunk of that growth is the companies that fabricate all of the consumables for oil field operations. So you think about pipe fittings, drill bits, charges for the perfor guns, everything that goes into that oil field. We manufacture a lot of that here. Actually, and I'll show you in just a moment, we lost more manufacturing jobs in the oil bust than we lost oil field jobs. Yes, yes. We are the hub of a lot of human capital for the oil field operations. So, oil and gas extraction. Oil and gas extraction. So this is a highly stylized graph. Okay, I've done a couple of things here to illustrate what I think is a good point. The green line on this chart is WTI, West Texas Intermediate crude oil price. That's it. That's all it is. It's the crude oil price. The blue line is the United States active rig count. Number of active rigs out there drilling for oil and gas or whatever. I have indexed the rig count to June price of WTI, all right, to the June price of WTI in 2014. Because that was the peak. That was, we had $105 oil on average for that month, and that was really the oil peak, and then the weakness started to show up, and then the collapse happened. And so I've indexed it, and then the red line is mining-related jobs in Houston. Mining-related jobs in Houston. And I've put them on here like this because they do a tango together. Whenever the oil price moves, the energy industry, being good capitalists, respond to prices, they respond to incentives, and they go out and they say, all right, price moved up, we're going to go drill. Price moves down, we're going to stop drilling as much. And it takes about 3 months. Whether you're in a boom or a bust or an expansionary period, there seems to be about a 3-month average, more or less, lag between when the price moves and when they can set up an extra rig or take down a rig. There's just a lag, that's a natural lag. Now, employment's a little bit different. Employment behaves differently during expansionary periods and during contractionary periods. All right, and we've been in a contractionary period. And if you look at the last 7 busts in oil and gas, a pattern emerges, and you can get some pretty tight answers. And then, yes, sir.
Is it a lag or is it quarterly reporting?
It's a lag. It's a lag. So you can look at the because the rig count data is available in real time almost. All right, so the rig count data doesn't come from the reporting cycle. It comes from weekly measurements from Baker Hughes or Drilling Info, and you can corroborate across them using, even now that you can actually corroborate it using GPS, that the weekly data is a pretty good signal. But that's not tied to quarterly reporting. And so because these independent streams, we feel like this is a really good, real relationship. Good question. Yes?
You said it was West Texas Intermediate?
Yes, ma'am. What?
What's the sweet? What kind of oil called sweet?
Yes, okay, so there are many kinds of oil. West Texas Intermediate is the main type of crude traded at the oil hub in Cushing, Oklahoma, West Texas Intermediate. There is also a commonly referred to crude oil called Louisiana Light Sweet Crude. All right, and it has a different combination of molecules. On average, the molecules that comprise light sweet crude are smaller than intermediate, and it has less sulfur, and it has some other different specifications in it, and that makes it sweet. Less. Sweeter crude requires less processing than sour crude, and lighter crudes require less processing than heavier crudes to make your typical fuels. But there are also other things that are manufactured in the process of processing these other things that matter for our refineries. And I can get into more detail on that if you like. I've got a refining slides. I'm happy to get into it and go. It'll be fun. It'll be fun. So you see here now in the last 7 oil busts, it takes an extra month or two after the rig count for the implodes, for employment to start to start falling. And that's unique to busts, when it's clear that the decline in prices, decline in drilling is big. All right? When it's just normal oil price volatility, employment is relatively stable. I mean, it's still, cyclical. But you're not going to fire all the people you just trained because you think oil prices are down for a week. That's not something you're going to do. You're hesitant to get rid of the human capital that you have recruited and developed. So you need a good reason, like a major oil bust, to do that. And when you see it decline, a pattern emerges here. You look over the last 7 oil busts, and this oil bust seems to be moving right down the middle of the trend that you look at the last ones. Once the oil price bottoms, and it bottomed in February of 2016, once the oil price bottoms, about 3 months later, the rig count bottoms. It bottomed in February, price bottomed in February, rig count bottomed in May. 3 months later. How much longer before employment bottoms? Employment typically bottoms about a year later. All right? And right now, it looks like employment bottomed in December. And the data, this part of the data, remember, is unrevised. And I think it's going to be revised down a little bit, and it's going to be right here. But it's right down the middle. So it takes about a year for employment to bottom out once the oil price bottoms out in an oil bust. And you never know when you're in the bust when the bottom is until later on. Hindsight's 20/20. We know $26 was the bottom. But we thought this was the bottom. Initially, we saw this rebound and said, okay, the prices is better. And then sure enough, the drilling, the decline in the rig count halted, and then price declines resumed, and the decline in the rig count resumed. We didn't know until we were about here that this really was a bottom for the oil price. So hindsight's 20/20. Now, oil prices moved up into the $40 to $50 range, and then as soon as OPEC announced that they were going to cut supplies, as soon as it became apparent that they were likely to cut supplies, prices popped up from $40 to $50 to the $45 to $55 range. And they've been roughly in that trading range ever since, although they've been declining here. But the trajectory for employment, I think, is still up. All right? And there's a lot of wells that we have drilled that we have yet to complete, and we're still trying to find people. Schlumberger, you name it. They're all out there hiring people to try to go out there and work in these fields and catch up with a lot of the work that they've got going on right now. Although the outlook is starting to look a little bit less certain. You take that red line from this graph, red line here, and you blow it up. You blow it up by its components. Different sectors in Houston that are deeply tied to the rig count. You've got fabricated metals. That's the most volatile. That's the when the oil price moves down, the first thing you do is stop buying stuff. I've got some stuff in inventory. I don't need to order anymore. I'm going to cancel some orders. And the guy running the job shop down in Houston or in West Texas who fabricates that stuff for you, that's the first job to go, is those guys. Then the oil field services, the support activities. That's the oil field services company, the guys doing the drilling and the fracking. Then they're the next to go. And then they're the second most volatile. And you see the blue line and the green dotted line have ticked up, and they're growing pretty robustly. And that green line is the driver behind that manufacturing number that you saw earlier. And you'll see that one more time. But some sectors of the energy industry are still in contraction. They're still lagging the rest of the recovery. And these are going to be your engineering and services firms. They're still lagging. You're looking at your some of your extraction, some of the extraction jobs, some of the higher human capital jobs that are harder to come back. It takes time. You got to have a longer term plan. You have to have a little bit more confidence before you hire back some of these people. And some of these jobs just takes a lag. We've got to get some. We've got to work through a lot of our excess capacity and say equipment before we start hiring back some manufacturing jobs. And to be honest, this is also a crude measure. Okay. No pun intended. It is a crude measure, and there are some things mixed in here that are not oil and gas specifically. But in Houston, oil and gas dominates the volatility of this series, so it works. When you look at manufacturing, this is the cause of that big manufacturing number that we saw, a growth rate. So total durable goods, separated out non-durable, durable goods manufacturing up 20.1%. on an annualized basis. That's year over year, but flat actually February to May. Machinery is still declining in the last 3 months. Machinery has been declining. A little bit more on that a little bit. But fabricated metals has been really, really growing earlier in this year, and they slowed down a bit in the last 3 months. They slowed down quite a bit in the last 3 months. This is a volatile series. But that's what's driving the total manufacturing job growth. That and the machinery. Machinery is getting a hit from the petrochemical side. They've also been getting a hit from overcapacity in global markets because we sell a lot of capital equipment around the world from Houston. And so there's a couple of things that are dragging on machinery, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Chemicals, that may not seem like an exciting number, especially next to that number, all right? But chemical employment is still growing because we've had this chemical boom, and I've got another slide on that in just a second here, and so that's important. You're seeing this chemical thing grow. Petroleum and coal products, that's refineries. Nice to see that they've been growing, but total non-durable goods is down. Interesting fun fact, our biggest non-hydrocarbon manufacturing sector, one of our biggest non-hydrocarbon, non-oil and gas related manufacturing sector is baked goods and tortilla manufactories. Still growing. So, please.
Chemicals, isn't that a 7-year cycle?
It is a cyclical thing. This is a little bit more than a 7-year thing, 7-year cycle. So there is a regular building cycle. About every 7 years they come in. They add in some new plants. They expand some existing things. They bottleneck versus debottleneck. They do some work. They bring themselves up to date with new environmental regulations. And part of that is just because part of that is because, when you get these lumps of regulatory rules cut through, it takes a while to define the rules, get the permits approved, and so there's a natural cycle. What's happening now is a different game. Actually, until about 4 years ago, this was the slope for chemical manufacturing employment. Steady, steady, steady loss in Houston and Texas. Partly due to increased automation, but mostly due to the fact that this was an industry that was uncompetitive. It did not have really bright prospects in the United States. Like I said, we were relatively uncompetitive. Feedstock costs were relatively high, and we would invest largely because the government forced us to for environmental reasons, or because we had some specialty chemicals or other specialty products that we were sort of maneuvering into. But it was an industry that was sort of, none of the focus was on the United States. The focus was on Asia. Asia was everything. Asia and the Middle East, but Asia and the Middle East were everything. More on that in a bit. What does it take to drill? What does it take to drill a well? Last year, in the end of the first quarter, we asked 150 oil and gas companies, both on the E&P side, exploration and production, and the oil field services side. We asked them all, what does it take to drill an extra well, a new well, in the top places that you're active? And they told us all these different prices. You can see the spread. There are places in the Eagle Ford last year you could have made money at 30. There are places last year you had to have $90 to make money. But the average was about 53 in the Eagle Ford, 51. In total, you needed about $50. This was the magic number, $50 to justify putting in new wells on average. If we could hit $50, then the rig count would rise, or at the very least stay steady. That was a year ago. We asked them a question again at the end of the first quarter, and they came back with a smaller number, slightly smaller number. A couple of things to notice here. Number one, look at Eagle Ford. All right, look at Eagle Ford right here. 48 versus Eagle Ford right here. 53. Look how wide that band is. Yeah, versus this band. They've really zeroed in on the sweet spots. They know exactly where to drill, and they know exactly what the economics are, and they've pushed down their average costs. If you look from here to here, so they've managed to bring down that average cost needed to drill a well down to $48. So at $48, we can at least maintain wells and even start growing vigorously the amount of wells that we're drilling, potentially. But that's the current technology as of 3 months ago. This is not a fully mature technology. They're doing longer laterals. They're drilling more pipe in contact with the shale. They're using more technology. They're inputting the equivalent of a Volvo of about 26, I think the median well in the Permian Basin, this is just an amazing statistic to me, so it's because I'm a big nerd. The median well in the Permian Basin is putting in 2,600 pounds of sand per linear foot of pipe. So 2,600 pounds of sand per foot. That's how much sand they're cramming into the ground down there. And this is one of the actual big sources of costs and big concerns for the industry. So this is what's driving this productivity, one of the main things driving this productivity growth. There are other factors. But we expect that $48 next year will probably be again about a couple of bucks lower. But you had a question.
Well, I was going to say, isn't there less demand for the people, materials, and all, so therefore it's a little cheaper?
Yeah, so their oil field services costs have declined, and so that's part of the story. And unfortunately, in this statistic, it's hard to parse out, the way we ask this question is hard to parse out what is the cyclical component, meaning we're in the middle of an oil bust, oil field services are losing money, maybe, and their prices are too low, maybe that's why their costs are lower, versus the structural, which is the increased productivity and technology. From the end of the first quarter of last year to this year, that's not as valid. That is the cyclical component there, that part where prices are in the toilet because drilling's in the toilet, and so yeah, your costs are lower. From 2016 to 2017, that's not as big a component as it was from 2015 to 2016. From 2015 to 2016, that was a big part. In fact, people argued most of the decline in costs from 2015 to 2016 was the cyclical part, where Schlumberger was just giving away their margin just to stay in business, just to keep business running, where Baker Hughes, where Oil States, and they were just, their quarterly reports were terrible. Because we want to keep our people busy, we want to hold on to business, maybe they were maneuvering for market share, whatever it is. We want to keep busy, and we're willing to offer you prices that are basically them losing money. Now they're making money. They were, in the first quarter, particularly in the second quarter, you saw oilfield services companies starting to get back into the black. All right, and from last year to this year, that cyclical part of it, that negotiation, that the oilfield services prices really didn't fall that much more. So that cyclical part is a smaller portion of it, so we can really say I am more confident in saying that $2 drop from 2016 to 2017 is more of a technological shift. And in fact, if you talk to the analysts for the oil companies today, for the Beige Book, which is one of the things that I do, they expect, and this was before we had this recent price weakness in WTI, their expectation was that oilfield services companies, they might get higher prices this year, and they might get better margins this year, but that the improvement in productivity would be enough to offset that. So they were still expecting, even when we were talking about over the course of the year, a 20% increase in prices over the course of the year for oilfield services, they were saying our costs, like our break-even costs for wells, are still going to fall because the technology is improving that quickly still. So I mean, it's pretty impressive. Never underestimate the powers of a petroleum engineer whose job is on the line. That's what it boils down to. We always underestimate them, and that's one of the reasons why these supply shocks always seem to surprise. If you look at the production estimates, how productive are we? How much are we producing? And how much are we forecasting we're going to produce? If you look at it for the last 6 years, if you look at this, what happens? It gets revised up. It gets revised up. It used to be relatively white noise. Sometimes we overshot, sometimes we undershot. Look at the EIA data. But the last 6 years, and particularly since 2014, we've consistently underestimated production, under forecast production. In part because of this technology, it's just hard to deal with in your projections and in your short run modeling and estimates of what current production is. This technology is moving so fast relative to the past that we keep undershooting what our estimates of production are. And in fact, the EIA is working on something here. They're going to come out with, I don't know if it's later this year or next year, where they address this issue where they've been constantly having to revise up total output from the oil and gas sectors. Any other questions before I move on? because I got a couple more here on upstream. I just had this in here that you can see, well, the Permian Basin's where all the increase in drilling activity has been. Interesting fact, natural gas. That's all it has taken to keep natural gas prices on the floor. Doesn't take much. The Marcellus and Utica shales have become so incredibly productive. We are getting gas out of here. But I mean, on a per well basis, it's nothing compared to what we're getting out of those wells. And so there's some very interesting things happening with gas production in Texas, but the main factor thing that we're looking at here is oil drilling, and it's all in the Permian. In fact, it's in just a couple of counties in the Permian. There's only 13 counties account for over 2/3 of the growth in drilling and production activity in the last year. 13 counties. It's like 4 of them in Permian Basin. You got 3 in Oklahoma, and you got 1 and you've got what is it? I'm getting my numbers mixed up here, but it's a couple in the Permian Basin, a couple in Oklahoma, and even a couple in the Eagle Ford, believe it or not, that is driving almost all of the production growth and drilling activity growth. But there's a problem, and this is the question that oil price markets have been trying to deal with. We've got too much supply, all right? We're producing so much crude that we're keeping prices low, and so from a driller's perspective, where prices are low, and that's bad. From a consumer's perspective, I'm really loving where gasoline prices are. But producers and the Houston economy in general would like a little bit more of a little bit higher oil price. But our oil supplies globally are too high to do that. And so we've got this issue where we have high inventories of crude, and the refiners come back in and they've been processing record volumes of crude, and that excess crude inventories so far has been turned into excess product inventories, and this yin-yang, we're going back and forth, seems to still be going on, although hopefully we should see some drops in inventories soon and maybe get a little bit better oil price for the producers. At $45, which is where it was yesterday, that's not really good enough. We can live with $45 for a while, but Houston, for Houston's energy economy to be healthy, we really needed to get it closer to that $50 number. Yes, ma'am.
The government keeps inventory too, correct?
Huge inventories, the Strategic Petroleum Reserves. Most governments have them.
Is that going down, is that up, is that included in here?
That is not included in here because those inventories are kept relatively stable. There are some that are moved in and some that are moved out over time, but it's not the marginal barrel. So it's not really affecting prices because that's kept relatively stable.
They seem to announce, it's kind of like they never talk about replenishment.
They have mentioned potentially selling X number. I can't remember the number of barrels. Yeah, a couple million barrels of crude. As a revenue thing, but so far they haven't done it. And they would wind up building it back over time anyways, more than likely. And so it's not something that's paid attention to. What is paid attention to in terms of, and something that no one really knows what it is China is building their strategic petroleum reserves. As their economy has grown and matured, they need a lot more of it. And they have been a major purchaser of crude oil and petroleum products, in part to build up their petroleum reserves. One of the things the market has been worried about is, well, when do they stop doing that? When do they say, we've got enough stuff in inventory, we don't need any more? And at that point, you lose a big purchaser. What happens to prices? So the market's been really worried about that. But so far, they still seem to be buying. They still seem to be burning gasoline. And inventories have been, relatively stable here the last couple of years. We're trying to get it to come to the OPEC, in theory, one of the things they're trying to do is to get oil inventories to come down a little bit so that they can have a little bit healthier oil price. That's ostensibly what they're doing, although we could have an entire conference on what in the world is going on in their heads. And this is OECD inventories and exports. I'm not going to go into too much detail on here, except that it's another factor that driving these expectations of what's happening in prices. See, people thought inventories would have already started falling. People thought that we would get higher prices by now, or a little bit healthier prices by now. This is what they thought in October and November and December and January, maybe not so much in February, a little bit less so in March, and a little bit less each month thereafter. And so you see the forecast implied global stock, the implications was that second quarter inventories were going to drop. And this is what most major market analysts were projecting, and now it looks like that's not happening. Or at least if it is happening, it's happening to a lesser extent than was projected. Even in June, this is data from the beginning of June on these expectations. All right, because the inventories come with a big lag. And so the market has now lost some of that faith, and that's why we saw oil prices drop the last couple of weeks. And this is the source of the increased uncertainty about the future trajectory of oil prices, the future trajectory of drilling, and how much extra accelerant, how much extra oomph Houston is going to get from the oil and gas sector. No one's expecting another downturn. And there's no one, that doesn't seem to be in the cards. But Houston was looking forward to getting a little extra oomph from the oil and gas sector than we had been. Ceasing to be a drag and starting to be something that helps driving the economy forward a little bit more quickly. How am I doing on time? I feel like I'm doing, all right. Good, good. So now then, the downstream side. Any other questions about oil and gas upstream, pulling stuff up out of the ground, before I move into the downstream, which is where we turn stuff into things people actually use? No, you just want me to hurry up and get through it so we can move on. All right, the refining and petrochemicals. So this is the different world we were talking about a minute ago when we talked about petrochemicals. So what you're looking at this graph, these red bars, that is the difference between WTI, West Texas Intermediate crude, and Brent. It's not a perfect comparison, but it does a good job of telling the story. From 2010, almost with minor exceptions in 2006, from 2010 all the way back to 1986, really all the way back to 1984, but this is a different data set. West Texas Intermediate crude was more expensive than Brent. What that basically means is that domestic oil in the United States, purchasing of domestic oil in the United States was more expensive than foreign crude. Okay? There, let's put that in there. Now, look at this blue line. This blue line is the ratio of oil to gas prices. The ratio of oil to gas prices, and I've adjusted it so that there are comparable units. But the ratio of oil to gas prices is this blue line. And you can see it's below the zero line there. It's below the zero line here for pretty much the whole way through. What this meant was that from this period all the way back, refiners and petrochemical companies in the United States, our raw materials for making products were more expensive than everyone else's. That's basically what that meant. And if our raw materials are more expensive than everyone else's, plus, relative to a lot of places in the world, we've got stricter environmental regulations, labor regulations, et cetera, what does that mean? That means we're at a cost disadvantage in the global marketplace. And this is why, if you look back at chemical employment in particular, and refining employment to a lesser extent, but chemical employment, you look back at the history of that data series, it was steadily dropping. Because from 1986 on, we were at a disadvantage. This was not the place to be for chemicals. This was not the place to be for refineries. It was elsewhere. That was the place to be. Then the shale revolution happened. You can see it happened first for gas. Natural gas production surged. Remember, everybody knew that gas prices were going to be $8, and then they were going to be $10, and then they were going to be $14. And my goodness, we've got this great resource in the Marcellus Shale. Let's go drill, baby, drill. And sure enough, we thereafter destroyed the economics of oil and of gas drilling, and we've crushed gas prices. And so suddenly, we had a huge cost advantage relative to others. Same thing happened for oil. We were pumping so much oil that we really didn't have the right infrastructure in the right places to move it. There were days in West Texas, in Midland, where you could drive your pickup truck loaded the back up with barrels of oil, drive it to Corpus Christi, and make a profit on the arbitrage. There were days where the differences between domestic crude and foreign crude were that big because we didn't have enough of the right pipeline capacity and storage capacity in the right places to move the product efficiently. As pipeline companies, mostly based in Houston, built out storage and pipelines, those differences eroded. And here we find ourselves in what we think is the new normal. We have a cost advantage in chemicals because natural gas and natural gas liquids, ethane, propane, butane, Houstonians and all NASCAR fans should know what those are. Ethane, propane, butane, these raw materials for petrochemicals are cheaper here than elsewhere in the world, and we can make plastic resins, little plastic pellets, PVC for your household construction needs, PET for the water bottles, the plastic that goes into your key, the little remotes on the keys for your cars. All of that stuff, we make it here really, really cheap. We export it to the rest of the world. They process it into products, many of which we buy back from them. And so we've got this huge cost advantage, and as a result of that, the anomalous, the 7-year cycle occurs. And it's anomalous because we've gone from being at a cost disadvantage to being at a significant cost advantage, and so this build out, and there's always, every decade or so, there's some major construction activity in chemicals. This, not like this. There's $165 billion of capital investment that is on the table that the American Chemistry Council is tracking. In Houston, Houston's is the home of about 65 billion of that in terms of total announced projects. About 45, I think is the new number, about 45 billion of that has actually reached FID and is committed, and they're breaking ground, they're moving forward. Huge increase in capacity. We were already the largest producer of chemicals in the United States. We had about 70% of the nation's capacity. We're going to have a lot more after this is done. And when that's done building these plants, we're going to have a lot of logistical issues on the ports trying to export it out to the world. But the main thing to think about for Houston here is 2017, this year, 2018, 2019. This is the original schedule for these project completions. Thousands and thousands of, the average one of these work sites has anywhere from 1,000 to 4,000 construction workers a day on site. And as that ratchets down, that's several thousand construction jobs that simply are going to be gone for a couple of years, at least. And that is going to be a headwind to our job numbers. That's going to be something that's going to be making our construction employment look worse. It's going to be a drag on the overall regional employment. It's going to be a drag on overall wages. Because a lot of these construction jobs are not low-skill construction jobs. They're relatively well-paid. And so what we were looking at, what we were thinking for energy was energy would recover somewhat in 2017, maybe not go gangbusters, but go better, but certainly do better, and that would offset a lot of the declines in construction. Now, there's some good news for us in terms of thinking about total wages, availability, amount of work in the region, and that true to form, most of these projects are not being delivered on time and on budget. Unless they rewrote the budget to now it's on budget. And so sometimes that happens where they just redefine the budget and they say, yeah, we're on budget. So there's been some delay in this. So we're stretching out some of the pain. Also, there have been some new announcements. Not a large number of projects, but some big ones, some really big ones. And those new announcements are stretching things out. And if this stretches out enough, we're still going to lose some jobs. We're still going to lose a couple thousand construction jobs as a result. But we might not see the big cliff, the big valley in construction employment that we thought, because by the time we get close to 2020, as we approach 2020, something else starts to happen. The cyclical build-out of refining capacity, both in the United States and around the world. So demand for those jobs is going to come back for the refining side of the business, but that's not supposed to kick off until around 2020. So we've got a little bit of a reprieve there in that we're not going to lose as many jobs in construction as we thought, but it's still going to be a headwind for the next 2 years. So 2015 and 2016, and upstream downstream related jobs up. 2017, 2018, upstream jobs are starting to grow again, but the downstream construction jobs are down. Put them together, this is probably going to keep these are going to dominate Houston's overall employment growth. It's going to dominate overall retail sales, and it's going to leave us at relatively anemic growth for Houston. Nothing terrible, but probably below trend growth for the next 2 years, unless something else comes in and provides us with a tailwind. The broader national economy, an improving national economy, could be the thing that pops us up. But that's still uncertain. The national outlook really is improving, particularly in Europe. But it remains to be seen what happens. Now, once we've turned these products into things that people can use, we do something with it. We consume it here and we export it. So if you look at the total value of trade, imports and exports, you can see it decline with oil prices. This is oil price here in the red. And you see this yellow line here is the Texas trade weighted value of the dollar. Now, the trade weighted value of the dollar is upside down. It's inverted, it's upside down, so that would be going the right direction for the chart. When the Texas trade-weighted value of the dollar, when the value of the dollar rises relative to other currencies, for a lot of your exports, that puts them at a slight disadvantage. When it falls relative to other currencies, in the short run, it puts them in a bit of advantage. And right now, and for the last several years, you've seen the Texas trade-weighted value of the dollar rise. So it's been a headwind to total trade. And we have a lot of employment. I think something like 20% of Texas GDP is in an export sensitive, and so they're sensitive to this trade-weighted value of the dollar issue. And so we're watching this. And we've had a little bit of a reprieve here. The Texas trade-weighted value of the dollar is declining this year. All right, so that's good for exports. But if you strip out dollar values and just look at stuff, look at total mass of stuff moving through the ports, it never really declined, and it's begun its upward trend as we add new capacity for chemicals and other things at the port to export, including exporting crude oil, ethane, propane, butane, you name it. We're exporting it all because we're physically running out of places to put it here, so we've decided to put it on boats. And that's what's going on there. One of the problems that we're having, and something that's being invested in, is freight. We already are home to to the most congested freight highways in the country, according to Texas A&M Traffic Center. 3 of the top 10 are in Harris County. And there is an issue moving this stuff around. There's plastic pellets are generally loaded up into 50-pound bags, 40 or 50-pound bags, and those 40 or 50-pound bags are put in containers, and those containers are moved around the port, oftentimes by truck. And we didn't add a lot of road capacity when we added all these chemical plants. And you actually recently saw a fight between Exxon and the state government about trying to get approval to increase the capacity of some of the roads between their new plants and the actual port terminals. And so there's some logistical issues in the port that are going to have to be dealt with, some infrastructure investment that's going to be happening all along the coast to deal with this. But of course it takes a lot of work to get infrastructure investment on the road, on the way. And that's one potential headwind here, and also potential opportunity for some. That's happening in international trade on the coast. Health employment growth. Before I get into this, does anyone have any other questions? Excellent. Should have sat in the front.
Brexit.
Yes.
How is that going to play? I understand that like Europe is crisis mode on some of this Brexit stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How does that affect?
We don't know exactly how it affects us because, number one, we still don't know what Brexit's going to look like ultimately. A lot of the rules have yet to change. And so remember, the Brexit is going to be a drawn-out process because we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. But whatever it is, and both in terms of financial linkages, which is the larger portion of our connection, and in terms of total trade, UK is a relatively small portion of our total trade. And so it would take something pretty substantial for that to adversely affect us. A bigger worry for Texas for a while would have been Brexit. If we'd had France for a while there, we didn't know what was going to happen with the election. Maybe the EU overall has some deeper stresses coming, and their nascent recovery is undone. That's a bigger worry because overall the EU is a bigger is a meaningful trading partner with us. But Brexit itself, not really an issue. Okay. So health employment growth. No shortage of things going on in health right now. I'm not going to say too much about whatever types of changes in policies may or may not occur because, number one, it's not my wheelhouse, and number two, we don't really know what would happen or what would be passed or what would be implemented off of anything that's on the table right now. What I will say, though, is that we did see a couple of things drive health employment growth over the last couple of years. Number one is catch-up. Remember, I told you health employment growth was a major factor offsetting the declines in the oil and gas sector over the last 2 years. There's a couple reasons for that. Number one was catch-up. After the passage of the Affordable Care Act, there was a notable slowdown in health employment growth, largely attributed to policy uncertainty because we didn't know what the rules were as it was going to be implemented. At the same time, Houston was experiencing, the greater Houston region was experiencing very rapid population growth. And so over the last couple of years, as rollout of the Affordable Care Act became clarified, and as it began to happen, you started to see health industry hiring a lot more, because it was time now. Okay, we know what the rules are, we know what we need to do, we have a new business plan, we can roll forward with that, we'll play it by ear, but we've got people lining up. The lines are getting too long, population growth is moving, and we've got to catch up to the population growth. Another thing happened. Despite the fact that Texas did not expand Medicaid, during that period when the exchanges were being promoted online and on television saying go and sign up for the exchanges, for the healthcare exchanges, a lot of people in Texas and in the Houston area who were eligible for Medicaid but had never signed up. And once they signed up, they started lining up for services. And so every time there's an increase in the number of people enrolling in Medicaid in Texas, and you can just look at it across the state, every time the number of people enrolled in Medicaid grows, and you can spot the policy changes where they expand it, you see a subsequent surge in health employment growth because you've just got more customers. And that's been happening. Both of those surges, both in terms of catching up to population growth and in response to increase in access to healthcare and insurance services, and increased enrollment insurance services, that effect is petering out. Now, another thing that's been happening in health is that we've been building a lot of hospitals. We have about 5 million square feet of hospitals that are currently under construction around the greater Houston area, and another 2 million square feet of physician service, health office space. So this is going to be your physician's offices, dentists, chiropractors, et cetera, all that, health services space that's not a hospital. So a lot of construction has been going on, and there are jobs moving in to fill in those positions as those facilities become operable. But again, that's an effect that's time limited. And we expect that, and you've seen a bit of a slowdown in health employment growth. It was growing well above its historical average for a year and a half. And now for the whole entire first half of this year, it looks like, it's been growing a little below its historical average. And so, health employment growth, I think it's still going to be positive. Health employment growth is about 11% of the region's total employment base, a little bit larger percent of the total economic base, and it is rock solid stable. I mean, it is almost acyclical. I mean, basically, once you're employed in health, you almost never leave the industry. You almost never have, there's almost no declines in jobs associated with recessions or booms or anything. So it's almost acyclical. And that's an important part of our economic base now because it's a very stable source of employment and a very stable source of good wages with generally pretty good benefits. Yes, sir?
You've seen a lot of emergency room clinics.
Yes.
In my neighborhood, we used to have one, now we have like 5.
Yes.
Why? There's something that I need to know.
Yes, we're all worried. Well, people in suburbs have just become more accident prone. No, there's a couple of things going on there. First of all is the Affordable Care Act. Under the Affordable Care Act and the rules for physicians and physician-owned hospitals, physician groups can no longer buy or expand hospitals. But one of the things that they can do is they can get into the emergency clinic business. And so there's a financial incentive, there's a structure like where does the money go, where do I expand? I have an opportunity, I can make money under the Affordable Care Act as an emergency clinic, and so I'm going to do that. And that was coupled with opportunity. There's a lot of empty space, particularly and perfectly placed for this type of business. Every empty Blockbuster Video and Hollywood Video location, that is now a doc in a box. It's now an emergency medical center, and it's a great location for that kind of thing. And I've done it. My kid fell off a play set, and it's like, all right, now he's got to go get a splint. We'll take him over here. It's cheaper than taking him to the hospital, et cetera, et cetera. And so we'll do that, and that works out for us. So there's both a real estate opportunity, and there was an incentive built into the Affordable Care Act that directed investment that way. And that's a good thing too, because you don't want those people who don't necessarily need, you don't want people who are not about to die in the emergency room. It's Just get them out. It saves lives. It's, every time Ben Taub goes on drive-by, every time Memorial Hermann goes on drive-by, the death rate in Houston rises. If you don't have to be in the emergency room, get out. And those facilities really help do that, which lowers costs. One of the big black eyes that Houston's health industry has always had is that it is so relatively concentrated into the medical center. And so the average driving distance was very high. Now we've got hospitals in the periphery that are being built aggressively. You've got these minor emergency medical care centers. It's really going to help, I think, the expectation is that that's going to help bring down overall costs and hopefully help improve outcomes, but that remains to be seen. Okay. So health. Construction and real estate. So this is office square footage under construction. That's the blue line, total under construction. And the red line is starts. New construction started. Now I've smoothed this out. So this is a centered 3-quarter moving average. All right? So I've smoothed this out so that it looks nice and clean. And this includes first quarter of 2017 data. So this does include data for the first quarter of 2017. But you look at this number here, total under construction has declined as total construction starts have basically gone away. We're not starting anything new, and the stuff that we were building before, that we started earlier, is now completing. And that's putting downward pressure on demand for construction employment. Now, we're not hearing about construction wages fall or anything, but we are seeing some downward pressure on demand for construction labor in Houston. And we are actually seeing people sort of move, maybe going to other cities to satisfy demand. We've been a little bit of an uptick here, so maybe we found, the number of square feet started isn't going to drop below 0. You can always be, feel happy that it's not going to go below 0, although who knows, we may start destroying buildings. But total under construction is falling. The Q1 office vacancy rate is about 20.2%. The monthly estimate from CBRE that says that we're a little over that now. So when the Q2 numbers are finalized, when we get the summer numbers, it looks like we're going to be closer to 22-24% vacancy rates. Still nothing compared to the vacancy rates in the late 80s. The office vacancy rate didn't drop down to 50% until 1990 in Houston, way back then. So we're still doing pretty good, but this is about where we were in the 2001 recession in terms of office vacancy. It's a lagging indicator, so it takes time. If you're a real estate person, this isn't a bad industry. This is an industry with great opportunities for customers to get who were previously priced out to maybe come in and rent space, right? So there's an oversupply of office. There is a lot of square footage available for sublease. There is currently more sublease vacancies than there used to be sublease space. A lot of that from the oil and gas sector, who just does not have as big a footprint as they were thinking they were going to have 2 years ago. So this market is something that is of concern, particularly office, which we think is bottoming out. Although no recovery is in sight, not with a vacancy rate that high. We're seeing it in, apartments. Apartment development is very oversupplied. And it's in apartment development is very oversupplied. The vacancy rates are rising. And you're not seeing much fall in overall rent prices. Monthly rent prices, but you're seeing bigger concessions. So you're still seeing like, all right, well, no deposit, no money down, 4 months free with a 2-year contract. And the developer says, all I need to do is get to 60-70% and I can flip it. And that was true, but now it's getting harder and harder to flip that property. And so they're saying, well, now I'm going to have to be a manager, and I've got to get this thing leased up to 80% or whatever my business model says it needs to be for that thing. And so this market is oversupplied, which is nice for consumers. And it's nice because it's potentially giving a relief valve, to people who are having trouble finding a home because the home market is so tight. So they're saying, well, I would go buy a house, but the market's pretty competitive right now, and the supplies are really tight, so I can just stay in an apartment. And it is a relief valve to a lot of young millennials, and not so young millennials, and millennials at heart, who are, for a variety of reasons, now have a lot of apartments that they can rent, townhomes that they can rent, that are more affordable than homes that they may not be able to buy at the moment. You look at overall construction employment, you can see in heavy and civil, this is a volatile number, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's been in this 5 to 10% range for a while now in terms of declines. And a big chunk of that is tied to what's happening in petrochemicals. Construction of buildings, you're seeing that decline both last 3 months and year over year. Specialty trades, again, very volatile, but that's the plumbers and electricians. There's actually shortages of those guys still. Senior plumbers, senior electricians, people who've gone into the trades and established themselves, there's actually still shortages of those guys. So, take those numbers with a grain of salt. They're very volatile. But overall, we're seeing this trend, not just in Houston either, but we're seeing it all across Texas, weakness in construction employment. Real estate and leasing, leasing offices is down, and so that's down as well. Housing market. Before I go into this graph, this is, by the way, one of my favorite graphs. It's Econ 101 writ large. Anyone have any other questions, things you want me to go back over or address? No? Okay. Housing market. So why is this my favorite graph? This is Econ 101 writ large. You got supply, you got demand, you got prices. It's good stuff. All right, so the red line. This is a little bit different from how you're used to seeing this number. This is total existing home sales in the greater Houston area from the Houston Association of Realtors. Total existing home sales, okay? Scaled for the total labor force, all right? Scaled for the total labor force, all right? So there's a moving average labor force. In theory, I figure as terms of adjusting for population growth, the population of people who have or want a job is probably a better population to work with. On average, we don't expect people who don't have jobs to buy houses. That might not have been the case in 2006, but it's a fair expectation, right? So it's scaled. And by doing that, you can see it takes sort of the facts, it takes away the issue that you have when you look at the data when you say, oh my goodness, Houston sold a record number of houses last month or the month before that. And yeah, of course we did. We've never had this many houses to sell or this many people to buy them. So of course we have high numbers. Scale it for population, it takes that away. Now, you can clearly see the housing boom. You can clearly see the housing bust. Remember the first graph I showed you? Where we said, all right, you saw the industry mix in Houston change relative to the rest of the country? That was this right here, the housing boom. You can see the collapse. Anyone remember what these two spikes in home sales were in 2010, in 2009? No. Those two spikes in home sales were the home buyer's tax credit. And it said, all right, as you can see from the robust sales that followed, it totally revitalized the home sales industry, which is sarcasm. People who were going to buy their houses over here moved up their purchases in time, but it didn't really have much of an effect. Now you see here, 2011, 2012, Houston's economy is getting rip-roaring hot. The shale revolution is on. We're out of the Great Recession, and you see demand start to rise again. And what happens to the blue line? Blue line starts going up. So, now I want to ask you, prices are rising here. How would you describe prices, the blue line, from 2002 to 2012? It's flat, right? In real dollar terms, housing prices in aggregate did not appreciate in Houston over that decade. Now, obviously, there were pockets that appreciated and pockets that depreciated, but in median, by an average, any way you care to look at it, real prices really didn't move much. Because, why? What happened when people lined up to buy houses in 2006 and 2005 and 2007? Yeah, they got script. We built houses. When people lined up to buy a house, we said, sure, we'll build you a house. We can do that really easy. Regulations are relatively lax here. We can plug in all the utilities. We can establish. It's easy to build a new neighborhood in Texas relative to other places. So we didn't have a housing asset price bubble the way everyone else did. When people lined up to buy houses, we built more houses. So our prices didn't move. Now, people started lining up to buy houses again. Sure, credit was more constrained, but we had a lot more people, and sure, but prices started to rise. What happened? And inventories of houses fell. The number of houses available to purchase, despite the fact that demand was rising. What happened? When people lined up to buy a house this time, we couldn't build anymore, or we couldn't build enough. Why was that? That was largely because the Dodd-Frank. We had higher capital requirements on banks in order to develop land. We didn't get in a lot of trouble financially in the Great Recession in Texas, but we did get in trouble. Land loans did get a bit of a bad mark. And we had increased capital requirements for land loans, and land developers who were getting 80–90% financing on their developments suddenly were getting 40% and 50%. It's a lot harder to develop land for that. And so the pipeline of land development, of lots to build new houses, shrank. And so the physical availability of lots to build new houses on shrank. So we built fewer houses. Our population was booming. Constricted supply plus growing demand equals rising price. Econ 101, right? Perfect. It's great. Now then, but they did build some lots. They did build some lots. Which lots did they build? Lots where they expected to have communities with houses that they could make money on. It was more expensive to build, so you need more margin in the house that you're going to sell, right? So you build lots for expensive houses. Who buys expensive houses in Houston? The energy industry is a disproportionate percentage of the people who buy the more expensive houses in Houston. So we developed all these lots. We have a particular audience, and then what happened in 2014? All those people who were going to buy those houses said, I'll hold off a year on that construction project. I'll hold off. I'm not going to buy. And so you saw pockets. You saw it in the Woodlands. You saw it, some of it in the energy corridor. You saw some all around Houston, pockets of high-priced neighborhoods where sales plummeted and inventories rose. I hope you did not buy speculatively in a high-priced market, in 2014, because you're still holding on to that property today. You could probably sell it this year, maybe next year. But nonetheless, those markets, these were the ones that suffered. Outside of those higher-priced markets, those 500,000, million-plus home neighborhoods, market was still very, very tight. Market was still very, very tight. From $250,000 to $500,000 private homes, supplies are extremely tight. You're still hearing stories about bidding wars all over Houston because of that supply, because we didn't build. Now we're starting, the pipeline of developed lots that are being delivered has now shifted to smaller sizes. And so we should get some supply relief maybe next year. So hopefully this price trend will arrest as we start to get more supply. But no one at this point is projecting any type of decline in aggregate home prices. Home prices are going to be higher in Houston probably for the foreseeable future. But it's a tight market. I just moved last month and I lost 2 bidding wars on people who bought the house on people who were making offers before the house was listed. It's a different world. You look at permitting behavior. This is a telling of future home construction, future residential construction. One notable thing has happened. Number one, of course, since 2016, single-family units is up. That's a good thing. That's good construction demand. It's housing units. And typically people then go on and they buy other things like appliances, and they send their kids to school, the new schools, and they got to buy all the stuff for that. So there's all that going on. But this blue line, the total finally ticked up. And that's because we finally maybe have seen the bottom in the permitting demand and the permits being filed for multifamily. Multifamily was the thing that was pulling that down, because when it became apparent that we were going to be way oversupplied, we had way too much stuff in the pipeline, they stopped applying for permits for multifamily, and that pulled down the total. I didn't put a multifamily on here explicitly because it's so volatile that it messes up the graph, but you can see, multifamily is the thing that's driving that total number to do something different from single family, and that's now ticked back up. So. Housing market looks like it's, the leading indicator of housing construction looks like it's turned the corner. And maybe housing construction can soak up some, though certainly not all, some of the demand for construction workers that we're losing in the industrial side. Outlook. If you don't know what this chart is depicting, you need to. This is the Houston Purchasing Managers Index. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what area you're interested in researching, if they have a purchasing manager's index, you should probably pay close attention to it. This is not only proven to be one of our best real-time indicators of job growth and output growth in the Houston area, but it's even good at predicting revisions to employment growth in the area and output growth in the area. So it's very, very powerful. And what you're looking at on this chart, the blue line is the PMI, the orange line there is employment growth. And they're practically moving edge of average of each other, and the employment growth tends to lag the PMI at about 3 months. About 3 months. Whatever the PMI does, about 3 months later, employment's going to do something similar. And that holds true over pretty much the entire sample here. And it looks like now it's telling us that we should expect employment growth going forward. So that's a good sign. A major corroboration of the story that Houston has turned a corner. Job growth took a little longer to turn. Job ads. Number of advertisements for jobs took a little bit longer to turn. This is Help Wanted Online. And this data comes from the Conference Board, and they produce a series for Houston. They have great detail. So if you want to even look at an occupation level demand, you can go into specific occupations and look at job ads. It's a great data set if you're interested in looking at the labor demand in a particular region. And it's finally turned north. And that suggests that we should see job growth both this month when it comes out and in the next several months. So another sign that Houston really has turned the corner. And you look at our other two major leading indexes. The Texas leading index produced by the Dallas Fed, very highly correlated with Houston. The major industries that drive Houston also drive this index. And it's ticked up. It weakened a little bit here in the most recent data point, but it's still generally supportive of positive employment growth. And the U.S. leading index has been accelerating here for the last year, basically, been ticking up. And it has a positive relationship with Houston at about 6 to 8 months. Has a longer lag. But all of these things are telling us that we should expect a tailwind from the United States, that the state at large is turning a corner, that employment demand really is growing, that activity, purchasing managers' indexes, overall economic activity in the region is ticking up, and all of this says the outlook for Houston is improved. So, do some sophisticated modeling depicted here, and you come up with a forecast. My official numbers are somewhere between 1 and 2%. It's been moving around in there. Some are saying about 1.3. Some models are saying 1.7. The consensus forecast right now is about 1.5. A little below. It rounds up to 1.5. But 1 to 2% employment growth, below trend. But certainly an improvement from the no employment growth that we saw for the last 2 years. 2 years of zero employment growth, and now we're growing between 1 and 2%. That's good for Houston. That's a good outlook. And I think it's probably going to stay anemic, meaning at or below trend, not just this year, December to December, so December's 2016 to 2017, but in all probability, I put a high likelihood, to the extent that you can forecast out even that far, that December 2017 to December 2018 will probably be at or below trend as well. Another anemic year, because of these mega trends that we've talked about, where we've got too much supply is going to keep lids on oil prices, and maybe oil industry is not going to grow as fast as we might have hoped, and we've got this declining demand for construction employment on the port because of what's happening in the petrochemical world, and then you've got mixed signals from the commercial real estate area. I think those are going to be the buffers that counteract each other, that keep us at or just below trend for the next year and a half, 2 years, in terms of total economic activity, total economic growth. So there's more data available online. You can follow those links. But at this point, I've wrapped up all the stuff on my slides. Happy to answer some more questions, go into more detail, talk about something totally different. Whatever you all want to do, I'll do my best to, in Fed fashion, avoid giving you a direct answer. So our growth number, our growth forecast is worse than other areas of the state. The increase in our growth is higher because we were coming off a lower base. We were hit harder than most of the rest of the state. Like Midland, Odessa, and Houston were just, And there were a couple of counties in South Texas that they've been triple whammied, not just oil and gas, but agricultural prices, everything. They've been really hit hard. But the I-35 corridor, El Paso has largely been doing fairly well, or certainly done better than Houston. And so while the I-35 corridor in particular has had higher expected growth levels than Houston, growth rates than Houston, we've improved more because, like I said, we were coming off of a lower base. So, all right, well, I don't know how we're doing on time, but I'm happy to take any questions that you didn't want to ask in front of everybody. I'll stick around for a little while, and I appreciate your time and for staying awake. So, thank you.
I want to thank you all for having me here today. Thanks again, Jesus. You know, I have to be honest with you. When Jesus first approached me and asked me about presenting apps for finance folks, I kind of was shocked because I've been spending the past 10 years of my life in higher ed, and even then I'm more of a computer geek. I did some brainstorming and I pulled in some good new essential apps that I think can help anybody in any type of role, any type of industry. And then I'm going to show you some other applications. And they're not applications per se like you would think. You would go to iTunes or the Android App Store, Google Play, and download and install on your mobile device. These are more of services. And we're at a very exciting time right now with what they call the Internet of Things. And I think you may have heard this term thrown about, the Internet of Things, or IoT. It's this new thing where we've got connected thermostats that are connected online, our TVs, our refrigerators, all kinds of things. Everything's getting online. And in doing so, a lot of companies have gotten together and made things interact with each other. And so there's interoperability. And so towards the end here, I'm going to share with you a couple of services here that have really leveraged that. And so even if you don't have a mobile device, you can use some of these services to kind of create your own automation. I think a lot of us may have heard recently about all of these bots, about how the Russian hackers used bots to spread a bunch of fake news and things all over the internet. Well, these weren't mechanical or physical bots. These were a lot of times just little programs. And what I'll show you here towards the end with some of these services, you can actually do the same thing. And the best part is all these services are free. So it can really streamline your productivity. It can help you do things, you know, something as simple as you can create a bot to where when you get into your car, it will automatically send a text message to your significant other saying, I'm on my way home. Do you need me to pick up anything from the store? And it's just little things like that, those are simple examples, but it's very powerful what they're doing. Back in the old days of the early computing with Microsoft, you had everything that was very siloed, and you had a lot of systems that didn't work with each other. I think we've all been there. If you've used Lotus Notes in the past, that didn't really work with other things, and things are becoming much more open and interoperable. So that's the key theme here to keep in mind. So here's a little bit of information about myself. And if you've never been down to University Park, we're actually housed in the old Compaq headquarters. So it's a great place to be teaching computing in one of the old cornerstones of the tech industry. One of the first ones I want to share with you, this is a classic app. It was just released. This app is the only one I'm going to share with you that is iOS only or for Apple users. I'm sorry, they don't have a version for Android. And there's lots of voice recording apps out there. This one, though, called Just Press Record, I like because built into it automatically, it will transcribe the audio. So, for example, I'm in a business where accessibility is a huge issue. Anytime I put a recording on the internet or on YouTube, or I make a recording for my students, I have to transcribe it for visually impaired. And so this is a great time saver because I can just record what I'm saying and then it just automatically transcribes it. And it makes it very easy to share out. So it's a very practical app. If you ever have to, like me, and if you're in a meeting and you have to take notes, a lot of times I'm in committee meetings and I'm too busy talking to take notes. and it's nice to just go ahead and click this, and then later on I've got the minutes transcribed. And this is a simple app. Unfortunately, it's only iOS. I'm sure Android's probably got one coming along. The next one I want to share with you is called Nebo, and this is another rather recent app. Now this one works with both iOS for Apple users, Android, as well as Microsoft. If you're a Microsoft Surface user, those are very popular laptop tablets now. The key thing about this one though is it makes this stylus unbelievable. What I mean by that is when you work with Nebo, you can handwrite with the stylus. If you're a stylus user in any type of mobile device, whether it's your Android or your iPhone or your Microsoft Surface, what it will do is it will automatically recognize your handwriting and convert it into printed text. And not only that, it's very good if you're doing any kind of diagrams, and you've used a tool like Visio in the past where you're doing flowcharts or anything like that. It will take your bad triangles and parallelograms, and it will make them into the actual classical shapes and draw all the connectors in. This one, I believe it's about $4.99, $5 or so, but this is an outstanding app. So if you're a stylus user on whatever platform, I highly recommend this, and start taking your notes digitally, and it transforms them. Trove is an email application. Now we all use email. We all have email clients that we're familiar with. On your desktops, you're probably using Microsoft Outlook. What Trove does is Trove factors in artificial intelligence. And what it will do is it will analyze your inbox, and it will get to know what your priorities are, who you communicate with the most, and it has algorithms and it has ways to prioritize them. And so Trove AI is kind of like having your own personal assistant that will go ahead and monitor your inbox. And the regular emails that aren't especially urgent, it'll display kind of grayed out. But those that are urgent, that are asking you a time-sensitive question, or if it's from one of your superiors or somebody that is a stakeholder in a project you're working on, it will highlight and it'll boost up to the top. So instead of you having to go in and constantly manage your inbox to try and set your own priorities, this will do it for you automatically. Yeah, and this is a nice one. So this isn't just for mobile devices. This can work, while it does have an app dedicated for both iOS and Android, you can put in your work email, your personal email, and just let it run. And this is a really exciting one. The AI factors we're really starting to see with a lot of these. And then the last one I want to share with you as far as the dedicated apps is this Accompany. And note this image up there, it's beta. This one you can search out, and what it means by beta is they're still kind of putting the finishing touches on it. So you can't expect it to be, you know, absolutely perfect, but it's a good app, and I've had very good use with it this summer. What this does is you set up Accompany and you connect it to your calendar, maybe your Outlook calendar or your Google calendar. And what it does is it monitors the events that you're invited to and you're attending to. But not only that, it gets to know who else is invited. And what it will do is, for example, today I have an event. It prepared an executive summary of the event, the location, the organization, and it will look for the invitees that are also going to be there, and it will prepare a little short bio for every one of them. And this is really cool because, and ideally, back when I was in the real world and I worked in sales, I would have loved to have this because it would have been nice going into a sales presentation and being able to drop, oh, you know, by the way, I saw your latest tweet on, you know, something, just to be able to connect with the other people in the audience. But this is a great one. This is one that just kind of runs in the background. They're doing their best to really connect with LinkedIn. So whatever your LinkedIn profile, that can be pulled into, or the other invitees, and you can kind of get an idea of their background. It includes everything from where they went to college, where they grew up, past companies they worked with, you might even find that you're in a meeting with somebody and you both worked at the same company 10 years ago. And so it allows you to kind of break the ice there. And so this, keep an eye out for. I expect big things out of this company. It's called A Company. To get to the application, you actually have to go to their website right now. And you'll see it's kind of Spartan, but they are building up if you go to acompany.com. And you can get more information there and sign up for it. Great little service. And it's free. It's not one of these things that, all of these things I'm promoting here, they should make your life easier. Nobody wants to add another app to complicate things, another thing to maintain. These are all things that can pretty much run passively in the background, but can boost your productivity and kind of save you a little time. All right. So now getting on to the good stuff. How many of you guys here use Google Docs? Do you use the Google spreadsheets and the forms to collect data to input into the spreadsheets? If you're like me, I'm a huge, I teach Excel. I love using Excel. And when Google Docs came around, I really liked the ability to have my spreadsheets in the cloud and I can access them anywhere. And then I discovered the forms feature. So if I needed to collect data from individuals, rather than giving them just a bare spreadsheet and expect them to format the dollar signs the same way I do, or format a date the same way I do, or even putting in a name. How many times have you had a list maybe and somebody put in last name first when everybody else's first name last? Trying to unwind all that can be kind of a challenge. Well, adding a form, a web-based form that somebody can just open up in a browser, is much more convenient. It allows you to kind of control how that data is captured. It goes into a spreadsheet. The problem with Google Sheets, though, is there was no way to really relate multiple sheets together like a database could. And if you're a database user like Microsoft Access, like I am, or if in the Mac world, I believe it's FileMaker Pro, used to having some of those nice tools, that's where Google Sheets kind of lacked. Well, along came a company called Airtable. Airtable works with Google Sheets. So if you're a Google Sheets user, this is like the next step up. This is the missing database for Google Sheets. And I love Airtable. One, it's free. And two, it allows you to create those online databases for collecting data. And so what I'd like to do right now is I'll go in and kind of demonstrate for you some of the features of Airtable. And hopefully when you're, faced with a challenge where you need to collect data from multiple users, or you need to create some kind of a system maybe because there isn't something already existing, Airtable is a good solution for that. So this is my desktop in Airtable. I have several different sample Airtable databases, and then I've got some I've created here for what we have. At the University Park campus, we have what's called the Innovation Room. And it's basically where we have a bunch of educational technology collected. And we have to reserve equipment for both faculty and students. So what I've done here is using InnoRoom, using Airtable, I created a way that we can manage reservations for both faculty and staff. And what I'd like to do is maybe just start off with a preview of what one of those forms would look like. And now this is very similar to those Google Forms I just mentioned, except this one is branded as Airtable and it feeds right into it. This is just a web-based form that you can use with a mobile device, or if you have a computer and you know the web address and you have that there. You can type in your information, and then you can even add in things like lookup tables. So here I have all the inventory of all the different devices. These happen to be the serial numbers, and then I can put in a start date and time. You can see it has these nice little built-in features like these pop-up calendars. These are very nice. It helps folks navigate along. So I'll go ahead and put in my date, and then I put in their end time for their reservation. Let's say they want to reserve it for a day. And then I submit that. So that's what our student workers would see. And you get a little thank you there. And then most importantly is that goes into a table, and I've got my reservation down here at the bottom that I've just added. And this, like I mentioned, it's compatible with Google Docs. You can make it automatically back up to Google Docs. You can export to Excel if you want to work in Excel. But it provides that nice, intuitive user interface. And one nice feature here that we especially like, and actually our students really like it who are actually manning the innovation room, they like this calendar view. This calendar view is built into Airtable. It's nothing I had to program or really create. I just selected it from the list and added that on. And so what it does is it'll filter through and it'll go through the table and it'll pull out the dates. And we can see records here by date, and you can see that reservation I just put in here. If we want to see more of it, I can click on it and I can expand the record, and I have all of the information here. In fact, here's the device that they were reserving. This isn't actually, you can actually include images and things like that. So this is a way where you can kind of use a free resource such as Google Docs and Airtable to kind of create your own system instead of having one custom made for you or buying something off the shelf. It's just a matter of you creating your tables for different items, whether it be products, people. You can see I've got these tabs along here at the top. I've got all these different faculty and students, and then different visits that we capture on some of that data as well. You've got different views you can use depending on what you're interested in. If I go to something like our products, or actually inventory would probably be better. If I go to the inventory table, we've got different views here. The grid view is that classic spreadsheet view, but it also provides something a little bit more colorful and interesting. This is the gallery view that it provides. So it's still looking at the same data, it's just presenting it differently. And so for some people who may be more visual, they would appreciate something like this where they can just look for a picture of what they want to check out, and then they can click on it and go into that item's record. So very flexible. I mentioned that everything's about interoperability. Airtable is one of these tools that you can connect to all kinds of services. For example, on the visits table, I've got a form where we collect visitor information. And one of the fields asks for a phone number. And the student puts in a phone number. And I've got it set up to where it will automatically send a text message the next day to the student's phone number with a hyperlink asking them to fill out a follow-up survey. And we're able to do that for literally tenths of pennies. There's services out there that will send out text messages for you for under a penny a text message. And there's a lot of cool things that you can connect with it and automate. And I'm just really jazzed about being able to take something off the shelf, being able to modify it for our needs, and especially with such limited budget, and be able to come up with these solutions here instead of having to go to the old days where you'd have to hard code and prepare an old-fashioned system, put the graphical interface on it and do some programming and logic and all of that. This streamlines all that. So if you're ever in a position, I would say maybe if you're like, I think you guys deal with expense reports, having to collect receipts and information from people. You could create a form, one of these, and have your end users just access a web address and they could update the details. They can even add an attachment with the receipt. They can take a picture with their phone of the receipt, add it as an attachment, and it goes right into the spreadsheet. It's right there. So I think that might be something valuable for you. You can use it for all kinds of different things. If you go to Airtable, they've got great support. If I go back onto the my dashboard here with my other ones, if you look at some examples here for if you've got an art gallery, here's one of them that they show you, and it'll kind of walk you through with some of the different things you can do. And it's all about these different views you have. So you can see different art that's on display. So if you ever get, like I said, one of those times where whatever existing software you have just isn't cutting it for you, or you're dealing with having to do emails back and forth, take data from an email, put it into a spreadsheet, you might think about some kind of a solution like this and let some of those automated services or interconnected services work for you. You can generate emails out of this automatically. You can do all kinds of things. So in the spirit of that, my other favorite that I like besides Airtable is, let me get back up here. If this, then that, or IFT. Is anybody familiar with this? This has been out for a few years. This is magic. If you really want the internet to work for you, you need to use this. If this, then that. I swear it's the coolest thing since sliced bread for the internet. Have you ever gone on Craigslist and looked for something? Okay. You could create a recipe, or what they call an applet, with if this, then that, to where it will search Craigslist for you automatically. And say you're into collecting guitars. I collect electric guitars. So I've got recipes set up to monitor, so when that 1978 Gibson Explorer is ever put up for sale on Craigslist, that bot is automatically out there working for me, and it's going to send me an email and say, hey, 78 Gibson Explorer is on sale. Here's the Craigslist ad. So that saves me from having to go through Craigslist every day. Now that's kind of a simple example. You can use if this, then that to do like I was saying earlier, where when you leave for work, your phone knows where you're at. The phone communicates to if this, then that, says, hey, I'm now leaving work at this date and time, and it'll send a text message or an email or whatever you want. It can even generate phone calls for you. If this, then that is another free service, and it's very user-friendly, and if you've never been to if this, then that, it can be a bit overwhelming, and that's what I want to do right now is kind of go into if this, then that. I've already logged into my instructor account here, and you can see these applets. You might see references of recipes. Recipes is what they used to be called, up until about 6 to 8 months ago. Then they changed it now and they made it more modern, applets. They call it applets because once you create one of these automations between one service and application and another, it really becomes its own standalone app or bot. You can create an applet that will monitor a Twitter account. And if there's a tweet regarding something, you can have it automatically retweeted out or posted to your Facebook. Remember how I talked about the fake news and how that was propagated by bots? Well, these weren't physical machines. It was something as simple as this. So it really didn't take any programming knowledge or any kind of genius or anything like that. Just took a little ingenuity and using some of these free services that are out there with multiple different accounts. So if we look at different applets here, I'll just do something live. I'm going to search for one. What's a good search term? Finance? Budget? Budget? So if I do a search for budget, we can see here, send a tagged email to if this, then that, to add a row in a spreadsheet. So if you need to update information in a spreadsheet, you can just send an email to a contact that you've got set up through if this, then that, and it will update a row in that spreadsheet. And this would be in the Google Docs spreadsheet. You can create a to-do item when your Geico policy renews. It'll automatically pop up on your calendar. If I click more here, you'll see this, see what else we've got. All right, let's go and maybe create one or look at some existing ones. If you just go through Discover, you can see some of them that are recommended for you. The reason why it's called if this, then that is once you create this applet or recipe, that service, that bot will be running. And if something happens that meets the scenario that you've described, like my 78 Gibson Explorer, if that shows up for sale on Craigslist, then send me an email with the posting. Then all you really need to do is connect those services together, add in your criteria or your trigger, and then specify what the result is. So it's just very basic building blocks. If what you're looking for happens, then do something else, and then you just punch in the different variables there, whether it's send you an email or send you a text message. See, it works a lot with a lot of different services, Google Drive, Instagram. You can see here, save your Instagram to Google Photos. Something simple like that. I love this one. If you lose your Android phone, text your lost Android phone, turn up the ringer volume to 100% so you'll hear it. It's simple little things like that. If you're going in between Android and iPhone, you can save all of your iOS contacts to your Google contacts automatically. Now understand, when you're using services like this, you are kind of opening yourself up. You are kind of exposing yourself to these services. So with things like FERPA or things that are certainly confidential or classified, top secret, things like that, those aren't probably things you want to automate in here, right? But if you've got one of those Nest thermostats, you got to be using this where you have it automatically know when you get home and it's going to adjust the temperature, or it will alert you when somebody is at home. You can turn your Nest thermostat essentially into a burglar alarm because the Nest kind of knows when people are in there and there's activity. It can have it send you an email or a text message if it detects activity. So then you know if your kids cut school early and are at home. It's tough being a kid now. It's surely tougher to cheat in school now than it used to be. And it's definitely tougher to be a kid because, let's face it, they're monitored through all kinds of different things now. But yeah, let's go ahead and create one. You can, just looking at some of these, WordPress, you can get that. If you want to be notified when a top app becomes free in the App Store, you can do that. Now this is just an example of some of them for Android. Let's go ahead and go into My Applets. And these are some of them I've created. If I've got a new row added to a certain spreadsheet, it sends me an email. Those are just simple ones. What I want to point out, though, are all the different services that are out there that this integrates with. This is what can be overwhelming. Best Buy. You could set up an if this then that recipe, so if something you're looking to buy at Best Buy goes on sale, you're going to be notified of it.
Excuse me, can I ask a question?
Yes?
How about, eBay bidding?
Oh yeah, I'm sure this is connected to eBay in here. eBay's got a lot of those notifications built in, but here's eBay. So let's go ahead and create one maybe for eBay.
Can it bid over?
I don't know if it'll bid for you. We can explore that. Usually it's more on notifying. Having it bid for you could get a bit... Let's go ahead and create one. I'll go... I know within eBay you can do the automatic bid. Yeah, that's built in, but you already have to kind of identify what that item is. Where this, I don't know if that 78 Explorer I'm looking for is ever on eBay. I could set it up on here. That's a good thought. Let's try it. So, my first step, I click New Applet, and then what we want to think about is, what's this? What is this? So let's go ahead and click it. We have to choose a service. Well, we already know our service is eBay. So let's go on down to eBay, and of course they don't alphabetize this, so I got to search through all these icons. If you see eBay before I do, holler. Like NPR, that's another one. I love that one because I've got one set up. So Tech News from NPR sends me a text message with it, and I've got it right there. So I don't have to monitor NPR and, for other things that I'm not interested in. Google Photos. Oh, eBay was in there. It's just a matter of finding them. Like I said, it's overwhelming with all of these different services that are on here. it comes that way, yeah. But this is what I mean by this interoperability. Everything is becoming connected. If you are a .com, you have to play well with others now. You cannot be siloed. You cannot be Lotus Notes anymore, if you ever remember using that. It didn't work with anything else. That's why it's pretty much a dinosaur now. It's all about openness and connecting everything to everything. And it allows us to be able to kind of thread them together to automate things for us. Let me just do a search for eBay first. So I'll just go ahead and, you can see there's six steps here. It's really not that complicated. So we'll go to eBay. So my trigger is new item from search. So every time a new item is listed on eBay that matches our search query, I specify. So I could create that for, my search term will be 78, Gibson. Gibson Explorer. And max price, that's optional. I'll just go ahead and create the trigger. So I'm setting this up so if any time there's a new listing for 78 Explorer, it's going to then do what I want to define right now in this next step. This is the that. So we just click on the that and choose the action or service. So I can have it send me a text message. But we want to see if it'll bid. So let's go back one, see if I can get it to bid. So on this, we'll look for eBay, and if it's on one of the trigger surface, no. Unfortunately on this one, it's just going to let you know. It's going to leave it up to you to pull the checkbook out and go through and initiate it. But then you can use hopefully one of the eBay built-in auto bid tools. So on here, other services, I could have it give me a phone call. So if I do connect on this, I just put in my phone number here. Now, even for these, I usually use a Google Voice number. If you're not familiar with Google Voice, Google has a service where you can get a free phone number. My son used it in college, and he had different phone numbers for different girls, and it worked out very well for him. He had a system. I don't know what it was, how he classified it, but he had a system, and so if he got a phone call on one number, he already knew. Yeah. So anyways, I suppose it's going to send me a PIN number and want me to put that in. Since I'm in here, I'm not really online. I don't know if I'm connected to get that. But that's just an example of one of the connections or one of the that's that you can create with if this, then that. You've got other things, Facebook, Evernote. If you want to have a note sent to your Evernote account, Evernote's a very popular online note-taking system. You can have LinkedIn, all kinds of different services here. It's really just a matter of doing some Google searches, find out what services out there that you're using, and then being able to integrate them and work on these automations. You can see all of these other ones. And I've got to be honest with you, there's so many new .coms out here in these services. There seems like there's a dozen new ones every day. Some of them you've probably heard of, other ones maybe not so much. All right, so that's my favorite essential service. If you want to create your bots, your automations, if this, then that. What I'd like to wrap up and show you another service that's out there that is very similar to Airtable, but maybe it's a bit more stripped down. It's actually a tool that I'm going to be using in a project management class I'm teaching in the fall. I've got a class, and traditionally it was a class that was centered on Microsoft Project. Because in project management software, Microsoft Project, that was the gold standard. All the other project management tools have kind of built off of that. Thing is, project management software has really expanded beyond that, and now a lot of our leading companies aren't really using Microsoft Project anymore to manage projects. They're using things like Basecamp, and I'll show you one that's coming up. They're using a lot of these cloud-based services because they really don't need a lot of the functionality that's built into Microsoft Project when it comes to maybe the budgeting and balancing out hours and things like that. They're more task-oriented and keeping people onto task and tracking due dates and things like that. It's where a lot of these cloud-based project management software tools have come on. And one of them that I'm very optimistic about is called Trello. Trello doesn't market itself necessarily as a project management tool. It's more for collaboration, or you can even use it individually if you follow like the Getting Things Done, or what's the other one? The 7 Habits, Covey. If you're a Covey follower or getting things done, Trello's probably a tool for you. What Trello is, and I'll log in here in just a second. That's one downside, is all these different services and accounts. Let's go ahead and we'll just create a new one. I think I've logged in with my personal one. So if we look at here, and what Trello does is Trello works under this concept like Kanban or cards. You create a card for everything. And so if you have a project, you can create a card for that project, and then you can further break down that project or that card into individual tasks and checklists. And you can have lists of lists, checklists of checklists. You can add in collaborators. You can assign people. You can set up follow-ups and due dates and things like that. And what I like about Trello is it's pretty intuitive and simple to grasp. So I mentioned I'm going to be teaching this to my students in the fall in my project management software class. This is one of the tools we're going to be using here, and we're going to manage projects through it. You can see over here on the right, you've got this sidebar where I'm identified by my initials. I could go ahead and link it to my profile where it's got my image and things like that, but I can add members to this project by putting in their email address here. And then once they're added in there, then it's just a matter of moving things around. So we've got different cards, and they're organized by columns. You'll see on the far left, we've got a to-do list. So those are tasks that need to be done. You can see what's currently in progress. So this is your WIP or your work in progress column. And then you might have a column on the far right of things that are already done. And so if we go over here on our to-do list, click here to open. I need to learn Trello basics. So this is nice. Right here in the example one, that'll kind of walk you through a short tutorial of it. You've got a board, you've got lists and cards. And the main thing to keep in mind is everything centers around these cards. Everything becomes a card. You can assign people to it, and then you can build in tasks and add in things like a due date. So here I can change a due date on this and make tomorrow a due date at a specific time. Let me go back to that just one second, because I do want to point out, it's hard to see, but down here it's very faded on the display. It's hard to see, but it says enable the calendar power-up. When you're using Trello, it uses this concept of power-ups, and the power-up is how you connect it to those other services. So if we want to connect our project in Trello to automatically send out emails, then we would have to use a power-up to connect it to the email service. Much like we did in If This Then That, when we would connect that to a service. Remember, it's a part of it's part of that interoperability, that connectedness, but you still have to kind of join the hands together. You have to identify what the trigger is and then the resulting action. So that's one thing to keep in mind on here. The free version of Trello provides a limited number of power-ups. They do offer corporate enterprise versions that require a subscription fee to get more power-ups, but you guys probably already know this. Working in education, you have that email address that ends with that .edu. Use that for online services. 90% of the online services that charge a fee to corporate customers do not charge education. And how they identify you primarily is by your email address. If you have that .edu extension on your email address, sign up for those services like that, and that automatically flags you as working in education, and you either get it for free or at greatly reduced cost. So get in the habit of always using that, and look for those benefits. A lot of times they don't advertise those deals. You might have to look in the support section of one of those services and look for special pricing for nonprofit and educational personnel and take advantage of those. Never pay full retail. Okay. So keep your eyes open for this. This is probably one that I'd recommend you dip your toes into after working with If This Then That, so you kind of get used to working with these different services and connecting them together. But this one, don't be surprised if you're working on a project someday and they reference, go to Trello, or you get an invite and somebody else has already added you to their project in Trello, and then you'll have to go in there and update cards and things like that. I assure you the learning curve is not very steep on this. It's a very simple, intuitive system. There's a lot of other project management tools out there like Basecamp that have a much steeper learning curve. This one, you can start simple, and it's simple enough where it can be flexible and useful in different situations. Yes, ma'am?
So if it's helping you manage the project, does it go without one step further and help you develop a presentation to your board?
It will not automatically create a presentation for you. It won't do that. But for something like that, I would probably develop an outline in Word or something and then just import it into PowerPoint. That's one of the quickest and easiest ways to create a presentation in PowerPoint, is to develop an outline in Microsoft Word, and then in PowerPoint you import or create a presentation from Outline. You just go to in PowerPoint, new presentation, and it'll give you an option. It'll either be from a template or a blank one or from Outline. That outline is a Microsoft Word document. And so your bullet points and everything that you've already defined and your headings in your Word document, your outline, it automatically sets those up in PowerPoint for you. And then once you do that, you can import it into Prezi. Prezi's the presentation tool I've been using here. And then you can add in a bunch of other graphics and interoperability and things like that and have it cloud-based. So it's not totally automatic, but it's actually not a bad idea. So there actually may even be a service out there that will create a presentation for you automatically on that. If not, somebody steal my idea and start the company and make it happen. All right, so any other questions on this? I wanted to just kind of introduce you guys to some of these services that are out there. Hopefully it'll make your job a little bit easier. My mantra with my students is, work smarter, not harder. And these are definitely things that can help you do that, whether it's shopping for that classic guitar you're looking for, or you want to organize your emails, or you want to be better prepared for that meeting, get to know some of the invitees and be able to have some common connections with them. Yes?
So you mentioned Airtable capabilities for web-based forms.
Yes?
Does it have a capability of putting a quantity and dollar amount to do like an invoicing type?
You can. One of the nice things about Airtable is you can build in logic and set views, and you can put in formulas. So if you can put in controls, that's where you can definitely add that into it. And if you ever need help on that, my email, I'll post it up here again on that. Feel free to reach out to me on email. I love helping you on that. If I can't help you, maybe I'm too busy at that time, I've got students that are well versed in it. I'll have them help you. I love getting my students out there and anything they can do on that. But get your feet wet in that. And I got into IT. I didn't go to college for information technology. I was an anthropology major. My BA is in anthropology. I thought I was going to dig holes for a living. And then funny thing happened. I couldn't get a job and didn't really want to go to anthropology grad school. So I went to work, and there were things I needed to get done on the job. the software just wasn't there. So I was kind of up to my own to engineer things. And the first thing I did was I engineered a PDF form that we used in a production environment to track how things were being assembled. And then I took that data and had to put it into a database. And then one thing built up to another. I needed the database to do something kind of like what you just mentioned. And then I had to learn how to program a little bit on the back end of that. And then that one thing led to another, and now I'm teaching other people for a living on it. So anyways. All right, any other questions? Well, I thank you for your time today. I'll put up my email, my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions on this stuff. I really love to share.
Do you have a question that we can share with everybody?
Absolutely. If I go right here, let me go ahead and share. Here's a link. What I'll do is I'll send it to you via email, and then you can go ahead and distribute it out. Okay. And I'll just keep this up here right now. You can just grab my email address if you need that. And then I'll follow up with you, Jesus. All right.